Blood Ties, a Witches of Mountain Shadow prequel novella. Written by Tarah Benner, narrated by the author, Tarah Benner. Chapter 1. Wesley. The zing of black coffee couldn't mask the taste of homicide in the morning. Walking into a house where someone had been murdered felt different from walking onto the scene of an accident, overdose, or suicide. There was always a certain coldness and a sense of disorder, something the killer had left behind. There was also a taste, Wesley thought, stale and coppery, like blood. The Vic was slumped on the leather sectional with his shirt hanging open and his pants around his ankles. The dregs of some honey-colored liquor gleamed in the early morning light coming in through the sliding glass door. It refracted in the crystal tumbler like light through a prism, throwing rainbow beams over the coffee table. The floor glittered with shards of glass, and there was a puddle of liquid by the arm of the couch. The condo's furnishings were what one would expect for a bachelor pad: expensive leather couch, Scandinavian sideboard, and a giant flat screen mounted to the wall. The place had wide planked hardwood floors stained a dark gray, and the sort of bland modern art that didn't command any attention. The open kitchen was barren, hardly used, though there was an espresso machine and a fully stocked bar. The victim was an investment banker for a prestigious firm in the city, single white male, late 30s. It had been his personal assistant who'd found him. Apparently, he'd missed an important video call after a celebratory night out with his coworkers. When he hadn't answered his phone after repeated tries, the assistant had come to investigate. Wesley had gotten the call at 8:30 that morning, less than 4 hours after he'd collapsed in bed after pulling a double shift. It had been Ruby's voice on the other end of the line. She'd been slogging through the double right beside him, but Ruby never sounded tired. She had already been on scene when Wesley had arrived at the swanky high-rise in lower downtown. She was freshly showered and dressed in her normal black suit with a hot pink blouse underneath. Ruby wore the same shade of pink for lipstick. The color popped against her dark skin and made her seem more approachable than most detectives. Ruby caught Wesley's eye under one of the layered chunks of her hair that swooped down on one side. Judging from the look on her face, this was definitely a homicide. She was speaking to the assistant who'd found the body. She was dressed in a gray pencil skirt, and her eyes were puffy from crying. Ruby thanked the woman and strode over to Wesley, careful not to disturb the shards of broken glass. "Eric Peckman," she said without breaking stride. 38, single, never married, unless you count being married to your job. He was working in a financial advisory firm called Egan & Associates. "What's your feel on the assistant?" Wesley asked. "She's still in shock. I think she was as surprised as anyone that her boss turned up dead. His cell will confirm that he had a meeting and that she tried to reach him." "Cause of death?" Ruby sighed. "We won't know for sure until the autopsy results come back, but it looks to me like his neck was broken." Wesley cocked his head to the side, examining the odd angle of the victim's chin. As far as he could tell, Ruby was right. The slump of his head was all wrong. He also had a dozen or so marks across his abdomen, straight lines 2 or 3 inches long. At that moment, there was a flurry of movement out in the hallway, and Ruby turned and put on her game face to usher the crime scene techs inside. "Come on in," she called. "Watch your step. I want everything in here photographed. Spend some extra time in the bedroom. Our Vic might have been entertaining a guest." Ruby drifted off to direct the crime scene with the bossiness of a wedding planner. He heard her muffled admonishments drifting from the bedroom before she re-emerged wearing an exasperated expression. "Children, all of them," she mumbled, disturbing her bangs with a weary sigh. "How many times do I have to say, 'Don't touch that'?" Wesley cracked a grin. He was secretly grateful that Ruby liked to take charge. He'd been with the Denver PD for almost 8 years, and major crimes for 5 of those, but he'd only made detective a few months back, and sometimes felt like it was his first day on the job. "I want to talk to these wolves of Wall Street he went out with last night," said Ruby, "before they have a chance to talk to one another and get their story straight." "You think one of them had something to do with this?" "I don't know, but our guy definitely had a guess last night." Ruby gestured down to the victim's naked lower half and the pool of liquid on the floor. It looked like bourbon. "With a little luck, they'll be able to pull DNA from one of those glasses." "Maybe they can pull DNA from the body," said Wesley, crouching down to get a good look at the victim. If he had been mid-coitus when he was killed, the perpetrator had likely left hair, saliva, or some other evidence on the body. Pulling a palm-sized flashlight out of his pocket, Wesley shined it on the victim's neck. At first, he thought he'd been looking at a hickey, but then he realized it was something else. "We need to talk to the last few women he dated," he said. "You think one of them was involved?" Wesley shrugged. "Could be. At the very least, they'd be able to tell us whether Peckman liked to get rough." "Nobody likes it this rough," said Ruby. Wesley could feel her giving him a look, but he hadn't glanced up from the victim's neck. "No," he said, "but take a look at this." He moved to the side so Ruby could get a better look at the nasty mark on the victim's neck. It looked like rope burn, except the neck was bruised, a hard purple line where he'd been strangled. Wesley was already hunched over the bar when Gabriel pulled up in a shiny black Audi. Wesley didn't recognize the car, but he knew it had to be Gabriel's. His brother traded his vehicles more often than some people washed their jeans, but he always drove up in something sporty with tinted windows and fresh shine on the tires. Teller's was a good old neighborhood standby. It wasn't quite a dive bar, but it wasn't trendy. They didn't brew their own beer or make artisanal cocktails, and the food they served came in red plastic baskets. It was the kind of place with branded neon beer signs, bartenders who suffered no fools, and the comforting warmth of a polished oak bar top that called to the working man like a siren. It wasn't where the rest of the force liked to hang out, but it was about as far north as he could coax Gabriel for a drink. Gabe thought that developers had all but ruined everything north of I-70, and he had an unnatural hatred of the Patagonia-clad mountain bikers that filled the breweries up there. The moment Gabriel walked into the bar, Wesley felt a slight tingle along the back of his neck. It wasn't a twin thing. It was a Gabe thing. He had a natural energy that repelled some and drew in others, the others mostly being women. "You've got some catching up to do," said Wesley when he felt Gabriel pass behind him. "I think I can manage," said his brother, sliding into the seat beside him. The bartender appeared as if by magic, the way all good bartenders do. She swept away Wesley's empty bottle and replaced it with a fresh one. "Johnny Walker Black," Gabe said to the bartender. "Better make it a double." Gabriel was dressed in a pair of relaxed-fit jeans and a white Henley shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His hair was darker than Wesley's and had grown out a bit since they'd last seen each other. It hung down around his ears in straight, choppy locks. On most people, it would have looked unkempt, but Gabe was pulling it off. "Killian's," he said, catching sight of Wesley's drink. "Feeling sorry for ourselves, I see." Wesley's lip curled, but he said nothing. Killian's had been their dad's beer of choice. Maybe he did order it whenever he was missing him, or looking for answers at the bottom of a bottle. "It's been a while," said Gabriel in an offhand voice. "I trust my tax dollars are hard at work?" "Oh, yeah," said Wesley, tipping back his beer and taking a long, deliberate swig. It wasn't Gabe's fault that they'd hardly hung out since Wesley had made detective. He'd gotten so busy that they'd fallen out of the habit of catching a game or meeting up for drinks. But they were brothers, and in the time it took Gabriel to sit down, order, and judge Wesley's drink choice, they'd fallen into their old comfortable ease. "New car?" "Yeah." A couple of loud guys were migrating over to the bar, and Gabe leaned back and stretched his arms, trying to take up as much room as possible. "I got a smoking deal on that one. Plus, I always felt a little silly plugging in my Tesla." Wesley snorted, nodding faintly as he stared down at the wet ring on his coaster. "What's with you?" Gabe asked, bringing the tumbler of whiskey toward him and taking a sip. "It's just this case I'm working on." Gabriel made a face as the drink hit the back of his throat, and he swallowed with a slight, satisfied hiss. His thick black eyebrows knitted together as he looked at Wesley. "Want to talk about it?" Wesley hesitated. He didn't want to talk about it. He wanted to forget about homicide just for one night. But no matter how he tried to distract himself, he couldn't. TV didn't do the trick. Neither did booze. At times, the need to escape was so acute that he probably would have tried something other than alcohol if he didn't have to pass a drug test for work. Maybe that was why he'd called Gabe. His brother could be a dick sometimes, but he knew how to have a good time. "I was called in to investigate a homicide today," he said. "The guy was a 38-year-old investment banker at the top of his game." "How did he die?" Wesley sucked in a breath. We're still waiting on the results, but it looks as though his neck was broken. Gabriel's frown deepened. Any leads? Wesley shook his head and took another swig. He swallowed and set his beard down lightly, his throat scratchy from the carbonation. We think it was a woman. He was found with his pants down, ligature marks on his neck, and they pulled traces of lipstick off the body. Gabriel raised one wicked eyebrow, a trick Wesley had never mastered. Wow, that's how I want to go. Wesley shot him a sidelong look. I'm serious, said Gabe, catching the bartender's attention. Fuck me hard, kiss me sweet, and kill me quick and clean. Gabe, a man is dead. I know. I'm sorry. He was already regretting his decision to share details of the case with Gabriel. To his brother, it was like working out who did it on a cop show he was watching. To Wesley, this was his life, day in and day out. It wasn't as simple and clean as pointing at the screen and saying, it's the fiancé, or I bet the neighbor did it. It was damn hard work and endless dead ends. The pool of potential suspects was practically infinite, and the evidence was rarely clear-cut. It didn't come with the satisfaction of a big reveal where everything suddenly made sense. Sometimes the perp got away. Well, drink up, said Gabriel, as the bartender sauntered over to pour him another drink. One for my brother, if you don't mind. He's bumming me out with all his talk of murder. The bartender gave Gabe an odd look, but gamely brought out another glass. Wesley quirked an eyebrow. You're paying, right? I just bought a new car. I'm a civil servant, and I thought you got a smokin' deal. Gabe rolled his eyes and glanced at the bartender. Yeah, keep 'em coming. I guess I'm paying. Chapter 2. Gabriel. It was nearly midnight by the time Wes passed out on the old plaid couch in his living room. His light brown hair was mussed in the back, and he'd changed from his wrinkled button-up to a t-shirt and sweats before collapsing. His sidearm lay within reach on the coffee table. It had taken 3 bars and 5 women coming up to talk to him for me to realize that he wasn't really up for a good time. I wasn't sure what it was about this case that had put him in such a dark place. In the last few months, he'd worked the case of a nursing student they'd found strangled in 5 Points, the stabbing of a single mother, and the shooting of a retired police officer. As part of the Major Crimes Division, Wesley had dealt with some pretty dark shit. This case seemed almost tame by comparison, but it was obvious that something was eating him. Once Wes was comfortably snoring on the couch, I wandered into the sad little kitchen and opened the fridge. Its contents were probably typical for a single cop. Beer, styrofoam takeout containers, some questionable leftovers in plastic Tupperware, and half a gallon of expired milk. The Colonel, his psychotic German shepherd, let out a forlorn whine. He was sitting on the grubby yellow tile with his metal food bowl between his paws, and I wondered if Wes had come home after work to feed him. Oh, now you want to be cool, I said to the dog, remembering how he'd snapped his jaws at me between the door and the jamb the last time I'd come over unannounced. I'll help you out just this once, but you remember who your friends are next time. The Colonel had come from the K-9 unit, but he'd flunked out of police dog training for being too aggressive. Wesley, bleeding heart that he'd always been, scooped up the vicious flea bag and brought him home as a pet. The dog still didn't have a friendly bone in his body. Opening up the pantry to search for dog food, I found a jumbo bag of kibble with the picture of a wolf on the side. I dragged it out and shoveled a scoop into the Colonel's food bowl, feeling his predatory gaze on me the entire time. To the Colonel's credit, he didn't move a muscle or make a sound while I poured. He just sat there looking regal and menacing, like he might take my arm off if I tried to move the bowl half an inch in any direction. And chow, I said, as I'd heard Wesley do. On cue, the Colonel bounded to his feet and began wolfing down the kibble so forcefully that the bowl slid across the floor. I tucked the dog food back inside, shaking my head at the pitiful selection of human sustenance. If the pantry was any indication, Wes was surviving on cereal, cup noodles, and spray cheese in a can. I wasn't sure how a 30-year-old man lived like this, but Wesley had always given himself fully to the job. If he put half as much energy into a relationship as he put into his work, maybe he could meet a nice girl, settle down, and pop out some rugrats. That was what he really wanted. Although, I thought darkly, Wesley would never keep any girl that got within 10 feet of this place. Everything from the contents of his pantry to the battered frat house furniture told the story of a guy who couldn't take care of himself, much less anybody else. That wasn't the case, but that was how it looked. Wesley wasn't hurting on money because he never spent any. He stayed fit and lean because he barely stopped working long enough to eat. If he'd been slightly less committed to the job, he might have knocked off work early now and then to go to the grocery store or buy a grown man's couch. Casting one last glance over at Wesley, I grabbed my keys off the counter and left. It was a full moon that night, which meant that supernaturals would be out in full force. I'd already lost time to brotherly bonding, and I needed to get going if I hoped to pick up the trail of the lone werewolf I'd been tracking. Nobody, not even Wes, knew what I did after hours. Wes and I might have been twins, but he was immortal and I was a hunter, sired by another man. You see it in dogs all the time. A dog gives birth to one pup that looks like the Colonel and another that's basically a Labrador. Among humans, it's a fleetingly rare occurrence called superfecundation. Wes didn't know that we were only half-brothers. Neither did Wesley's father, I imagine. Besides our easily dismissible differences in looks and personality, I was born with a supernatural drive to track and kill any magical being that harmed mortals or upset the natural balance. Wesley was not. Wes had no idea what I did, what I really was. My cover as a rare weapons dealer paid all right, but it wasn't nearly as lucrative as the bounties on some of the really dangerous supernaturals I'd eliminated over the years. Power-hungry witches, rogue goblins, and even a stray demon or two. Not that I did it for the money. A hunter's drive was pure instinct, like the Colonel's urge to rip my throat out and pee on every tree he passed. I hopped in my car parked outside Wesley's house and listened appreciatively to the hum of the engine. Despite what I told Wesley, I hadn't traded the Tesla by choice. I'd totaled it 2 weeks prior in a high-speed chase with a dark elf on a motorcycle. It was a major bummer. I never could have afforded that car, but the Brotherhood had given it to me as a bonus. Being a hunter had some perks, but these were offset by the life of secrecy and the sky-high insurance premiums. Pulling out onto the empty street, I took Colfax Avenue to I-25 and headed north. Wesley lived in Lincoln Park, but I had been tracking what was undeniably werewolf activity from 5 Points to the river. If it dipped below I-70 again, I planned to be there to kill it. I exited the highway and found a quiet street between the railroad tracks and a parking garage where no one was likely to wander over. Once parked, I killed the engine, turned on my police scanner, and waited with excitement. You didn't see a werewolf every day, even in my line of work. Although the state of Colorado had one of the highest populations of werewolves per capita, wearers mostly kept to themselves. They could live normal lives most of the time, but during the full moon, they had no control over the change. To keep from hurting anyone, most chained themselves up to wait it out or spent that time roaming the mountains and plains far away from any humans. Unless a mortal actually saw a werewolf turn, the only dead giveaway was a wearer's tendency to disappear once a month to go fishing or camping, which, in Colorado, was not all that unusual. As a hunter, I could usually smell any werewolf within a quarter-mile radius, but that wasn't how I planned to catch it. If it was prowling around near the bars on a Friday night, someone was bound to call it in. When they turned, werewolves looked like giant wolves, but in this part of the country, they are more often mistaken for bears or mountain lions. The police didn't usually do anything about bear sightings, but one near such a crowded nightlife spot wouldn't be ignored for long. I was pretty sure that this wolf was the same one that had mauled and killed a hiker in Rocky Mountain National Park the month before. Werewolves didn't feed on people, but, like any animal, they could be lethal if provoked or caught by surprise. I'd also heard from other hunters about a rise in lupine virus, a strain of werewolf rabies that made wearers exceptionally aggressive and eventually killed them. If the wolf was rabid, that would explain why it had been cast out of its pack. The attack in the national park had been blamed on a mountain lion, but the prints and bite marks weren't right for a big cat. The tracks were classically wolf, and I'd caught a whiff of the stink it had left behind when I'd visited the park. The night before, 2 neighborhood cats and an Alaskan Malamute had been killed in the area. I suspected the wolf was expanding its territory. Sure enough, not 20 minutes after I'd been parked, officers were dispatched to a warehouse-style brew pub on the corner of Brighton and 35th Street, a couple of blocks off the main drag. Someone had reported a large bear in the area. Starting the car, I sped down the deserted road along the tracks and cut down to the area in question. I parked a block away and killed the engine, consulting the built-in GPS map. I swore. There was a police station 2 blocks down and 2 blocks over. It wouldn't take them long to dispatch officers to the scene if they weren't prowling the streets already. I'd have to work fast to beat them to the wolf. Getting out of the car, I pulled on my thick leather jacket, useful protection against bites and scrapes. I grabbed a heavy black bag out of the trunk, which contained a leather collar, muzzle, and chain. Then I bent to inspect my weapons and the soft glow of the trunk light. If I couldn't be sure the wolf was the same that had killed that human and it wasn't infected with lupine virus, I'd be forced to take it in alive. That wasn't exactly how I wanted to spend my Friday night, but killing an innocent werewolf was a good way to start a war. Putting down a werewolf once it had turned wasn't ideal. It took 3 or 4 shots with a high-caliber silver bullet to take one out of commission. I liked guns as much as the next guy, but firearms weren't usually a hunter's weapon of choice. For one thing, they were loud. They were also useless against vampires, and an exceptionally skilled witch could stop a bullet in its tracks and redirect it at the shooter. Not good. But for a werewolf, a double-barreled shotgun was my worst option. This piece had belonged to my grandfather on my mother's side, and I had created my own custom wolf-killing ammo. They were ordinary recycled shotgun shells filled with silver pellets. If I could wound the wolf, I'd be able to get close enough to kill it. I had my Smith & Wesson loaded with custom .44 Magnum cartridges as backup. Closing the trunk, I walked around the car and moved swiftly toward the area where the bear had been spotted. I tried to stay out of the orange pools of light cast by the street lamps, but the full moon was so bright that anyone in the vicinity would be able to see me. Luckily, there were no people milling around Brighton Boulevard at that hour. I passed a coffee bar, an office building, and an art gallery, but all their windows were dark. Moving silently down the sidewalk, I took careful note of which shops had exterior surveillance cameras. The footage would have to be dealt with in the morning. That part was important. As soon as I rounded the corner, I knew at once that the werewolf had been there. I could smell wet dog mixed with the sour stench of hot breath. I dropped my bag on the sidewalk and continued to move, sticking to the shadows when possible. I could hear the throb of blood in my ears, but was reassured by the weight of the pistol against my leg. I reached a deserted tapas bar and sensed a supernatural nearby. Just then, I heard a low, menacing growl and saw a flash of movement in the window. Turning, I caught a brief flicker of yellow eyes before the werewolf lunged. I leapt to the side as a huge mass of fur came flying toward me, narrowly missing its claws. Supernatural speed and strength were traits all hunters shared, but werewolves were fast too. The wolf landed in front of the tapas bar, jaws snapping as it whipped around to face me. It was small for a werewolf and looked slightly starved, definitely unhealthy. The wolf lunged again, and I wasn't as quick. The two of us collided. The werewolf knocked me to the ground, but I thrust the butt of my shotgun into its chest to keep it from tearing into my throat. The gun wedged between us like a brace, but it wouldn't hold the wolf for long. I could feel the rumble of a growl work its way down thick, hairy forelegs, and I felt the hot drip of saliva on my face. Long ropes of spit trailed from its jowls. The wolf was definitely rabid. A rabid werewolf upped the stakes, but it also filled me with resolve. There was no need to capture the thing alive to confirm that it was the wolf who'd killed that hiker. Infected wolves had to be put down. Holding the werewolf at a distance with my foot, I whipped the butt of my shotgun around to smack it in the snout. The wolf let out a yelp of pain, and I managed to push myself across the pavement and wriggle out from under it. I flipped my shotgun around and fired. The kick would have knocked me back if I hadn't been lying on the ground. Instead, it just rebounded against me with the force of a small cannon. An unearthly yelp echoed off the buildings, awful enough to draw every mortal within a half-mile radius. The wolf darted away but didn't go far. I could still hear it pawing at the pavement. Scrambling to my feet, I cast around for the wolf and found it hulking in the moonlight. Its tawny fur was slick with blood, and its ears were pinned to its head. It lunged at me again, but I slipped to the side, its fur brushing against my sleeve. I wheeled around and fired again. The wolf stumbled with a whimper, but then it lurched to its feet. Its snout seemed to shorten as it bared its teeth, 2 enormous rows of white fangs. The wolf lunged again, but I dodged it easily, drawing my pistol from its holster. "Sorry about this," I said, taking aim. I caught one last snarling glare before shooting it between the eyes. My shot echoed on the empty street, and I knew immediately that I'd made the kill shot. The werewolf dropped to the ground like an old fur coat, its limbs twitching as it died. Its filthy, bloodied pelt gleamed in the moonlight, and a few seconds later, it began to change. A were couldn't hold its wolf form once the ether left its body. Ether was the animating life force of all living things, and supernaturals had it in spades. I blinked, slightly disoriented from watching the change, and by the time my vision cleared, a naked man was lying in the street. He was thin and gaunt and riddled with wounds. I could hear sirens off in the distance. Then came the hard part of any hunt, extricating the body from the scene without getting waylaid by the police. That would certainly be tough to explain the next time I saw my brother. Jogging down the street to where I dropped my bag, I pulled out straps and a black canvas sheet. Spreading it out next to the werewolf, I rolled his body onto the canvas and wrapped him like a burrito. Then I raced back to my car and whipped down the street for an easier pickup. It was tough to find a sports car with adequate trunk space. The Audi's was deep but not very wide, so I had to wedge the body nose to knee to get it to fit. It would have been next to impossible once rigor mortis set in. I made a mental note to remember that for next time. I was just pulling the privacy cover when a police cruiser rolled up. Damn it. The officer inside flashed his lights, and I slammed the trunk closed. The cruiser stopped about 15 yards away, and I raised a hand in greeting. I cast around on the ground to locate my shells and bullet casings, but there was no time to retrieve them. The officer got out and raised his weapon, blinding me with the beam of his scope. "Police!" he yelled unnecessarily. "Drop your weapons and step away from the vehicle." Slowly, I took the pistol out of my holster and laid it on top of my car. Then I took 2 steps away and raised my hands overhead. My heart thudded dully against my rib cage. This wasn't the first time I'd been caught up by law enforcement, but it was always a bit unnerving. Spook the wrong hair-trigger cop, and a hunter could end up 6 feet under. We weren't impervious to bullets. "Evening, officer," I called. The beam of light started to move, and I knew the cop was advancing. Behind him, I could see the shadow of another officer. It was always harder when there were 2 of them. Seeing that I was unarmed, the officer lowered his weapon. He eyed me critically and gazed toward my vehicle, shining his light inside. He could probably see the shotgun lying across the back seat, but that wasn't illegal in Colorado. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, blinding me once again with his light. I gestured behind me. "Just checking on my building. I live nearby, and I thought I heard gunshots." The officer glanced at the storefronts behind me and then back to me. He still looked wary, but I caught a small flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Which business is yours?" "The tapas bar," I lied. The officer nodded slowly but didn't drop his dubious expression. The other policeman was approaching slowly, looking more alert than his partner. The first cop sighed. "Can I see some ID?" "Sure thing," I said, reaching into my back pocket. I could hear the scuff of the second officer's footsteps as he shined a light on the ground. If he found the casings, I was screwed. They'd realize I was the one who'd been shooting. Clearing my throat, I handed over my license. It had my real name and everything. There wasn't much point in a fake identity. Hunters were skilled at getting out of legal snafus and covering up evidence of supernatural activity. "Thought you said you lived in the area," said the officer, frowning at my address. "I've been staying with a friend." The policeman gave me a raised eyebrow look, but then he caught sight of my name. "Pierce," he mumbled. "Any relation to Wesley Pierce?" "He's my brother," I said, cracking a smile. Maybe it wouldn't be so hard to talk myself out of this after all. "I didn't know he had a brother." The man looked up. "What's it called?" "What's what called?" "Your restaurant." I swallowed to wet my dry throat. It was something in Spanish. That much I remembered. The sign was right behind me, but I couldn't exactly turn to look. "We're kind of going through a rebrand," I choked. But that moment of hesitation cost me. "Hey, O'Connell," called the other police officer, who was still shining his light on the ground. "Check this out." Shit. He'd found a pool of werewolf blood and several smears on the ground. At that moment, I knew my luck had run out. I had no other choice. With lightning-fast reflexes, I shot out a hand, capturing O'Connell by the arm. In the split second before he reached for his weapon, his light gray eyes locked on mine. "You didn't see me here tonight," I said, holding his gaze with a firm look. "You don't even know Wesley Pierce has a brother. You responded to reports of gunfire, but found nothing on Brighton Boulevard." O'Connell's face had gone very pale, but he didn't reach for his weapon. His throat bobbed as he nodded mutely and turned to walk back toward the cruiser. At the sound of footsteps, his partner turned, and in a flash I was right in front of him. The second officer jerked up his pistol, but I locked eyes with him and held his gaze. "Lower your weapon." I felt some resistance. Beads of sweat sprang up above the officer's lip, and I saw the muscles of his face twitch as my demand penetrated his consciousness. "Lower your Weapon, I repeated, more firmly this time. A hunter's power of suggestion wasn't nearly as strong as a vampire's, and some mortals had more resolve than others. But inevitably, I wore him down, and he slowly lowered the pistol. I was never here, I said. You didn't see me. You didn't see anyone when you came to investigate. You won't come looking again. When a hunter encountered resistance like that, it was important to cover all bases. Suspicious minds had tricky ways of circumventing the power of suggestion, and if it was done sloppily, a mortal might remember events he'd been told to forget. The officer nodded. Get back to your car. My heart rate began to slow as the officer turned toward the cruiser. I stood frozen until the car pulled away and let out a slow breath of relief. It was time to clean up any evidence of the werewolf and make it look as though I was never there. Chapter 3. Wesley. It was late morning when Wesley got the call. His cell phone buzzed loudly on the glass top of the coffee table, a sound that seemed to rattle his skull. He opened his eyes and immediately regretted it. Sunlight was streaming in through the open blinds, flooding his living room with unforgiving daylight. He couldn't remember the last time he'd spent the night passed out on someone's couch, much less his own, and he could feel the texture of the rough woven surface imprinted on his cheek. Reaching for his phone before the vibration skittered it out of reach, he accepted the call and brought it to his ear. Pierce. Morning, sunshine, came Ruby's brisk voice. Did I wake you? It's Saturday, Wesley grumbled. And yes. He sat up on the couch and rubbed one crusty eye with the heel of his hand. Saturday was his day off. Not that he really ever got a day off working major crimes. Long night with Gabe last night. Ah, that explains it. Well, don't shoot the messenger, but we've got another one. They need us down at the scene. Another one what? Another probable homicide. This one was a surgeon. A surgeon? Wesley repeated, slightly dumbfounded. Most of the homicides he worked were either gang-related or the result of domestic violence. A surgeon was unusual. Down at Rose Medical. Looks a lot like our Vic from yesterday. I'll be right there, said Wesley. I just need to jump in the shower. See you there. Half an hour later, Wesley pulled up in the emergency lane, freshly showered and on his second cup of coffee. There were already 4 patrol officers on the scene, and the guys who worked security for the hospital looked as though Christmas had come early. Restraining the occasional tweaker was the most action these security guards ever saw. Securing the scene of a homicide was an exciting deviation from their normal routine. They nodded at Wesley as he flashed his credentials, barely managing to conceal their eagerness to participate. He joined Ruby, who was talking to the hospital administrator, a dark-haired woman in her late 50s, wearing dark slacks and a gray silk blouse. The administrator looked as though she'd barely slept, and her face was lined with stress. Homicide couldn't be good for optics, and she was probably worried how she was going to explain this to the hospital board. I just don't understand who would want to kill him. We're doing everything we can to get to the bottom of this, said Ruby. In the meantime, I'm going to need you to call Wilson. The administrator nodded and turned to leave just as Wesley joined them. What'd I miss? He asked. Ruby sighed. Security footage was a bust. There's a whole chunk of footage from midnight to 3 that's just gone. Erased. Erased by whom? It had to be the security personnel on duty. Or we're looking at a cyber attack, but that seems like an awfully big coincidence. I assume this Wilson was the guard on duty? Ruby nodded. He got off around 6 this morning. Whatever might have gone down last night, I'm guessing he knows something. What did go down last night? Ruby motioned for Wesley to follow, leading him out of the lobby. The Vic's name is Cullen McCann. He was a surgeon here. One of the custodians found him dead in the on-call room a few hours ago. Ruby led Wesley back to the room where the surgeon's body had been discovered. A twin bed was jammed up against one wall, covered in scratchy-looking hospital linens. A faux wood nightstand sat beside it, holding a lamp and a cheap plastic alarm clock. Cullen McCann was slumped on top of the blankets, dressed only in a pair of boxer briefs. His scrubs lay discarded in a heap on the floor, but his cell phone and wallet were on the nightstand. His eyes were still open, and his head lolled to the side. Something about the position of the body seemed all too familiar to Wesley. His neck's been broken, said Ruby grimly. Same ligature marks and contusions as Eric Peckman. The autopsy report on him came back this morning. And? Peckman didn't die by asphyxiation. His spinal cord had been severed. The medical examiner said that the marks on his stomach could have been made by a whip, and there was DNA belonging to a woman. So the killer whips and strangles her victims and then breaks their necks? Assuming the woman and the killer are one and the same. Wesley shook his head. What woman has the strength and ability to break a grown man's neck? The kind that seduces and kills white-collar men. Any DNA match? Her DNA wasn't in the system. They're analyzing the lipstick from the glass now. Wesley raised his eyebrows and let out a breath. Something just didn't feel right. He squinted down at the Vic's arm, where a smudge of red was visible. What's that on his wrist? Some kind of stamp from a bar or nightclub. I have a couple of academy cadets working on it. You think the security guard is involved? Ruby shrugged. More likely the killer paid him off or threatened him to delete the footage. Wesley followed her back into the hallway, which was filled with the typical hospital beeps and the sound of gurney wheels on tile. Ruby looked around, lost in thought, and put her hands on her hips. There must be 1,000 security cameras in this place. One of them has to have caught something. Wesley glanced back toward the lobby, where the hospital administrator was talking on her cell phone. Her face was strained from the stress of whatever she was saying. Rose Medical Center had an excellent reputation, but this would definitely make the papers. And a headline like, "Prominent Surgeon Murdered on Call" would surely be a blow to their recruitment efforts. "Ms. Stokes?" Ruby called, seeing that the administrator had just finished her phone call. "Do you have a record of every staff member who was on call last night?" The administrator nodded numbly. "Mary Allen can help you with that," she said, pointing at a bank of offices. Ruby gave a curt nod of thanks and exchanged a look with Wesley. They'd been working together long enough to develop their own methods. After one of them felt they'd exhausted a witness, the other would take a stab. Sometimes they didn't learn anything new, but other times it turned up something useful. "Miss Stokes," said Wesley, careful to keep his distance in case she could smell last night's alcohol seeping through his pores. "Brenda." Wesley pulled a weak smile. "Do you mind if I ask you a few more questions?" "I already told the detective everything I could think of," she huffed, looking more exhausted than annoyed. "That's all right. It would help me get up to speed, if you don't mind going through it again." Judging from the look on her face, Brenda did mind, but she gave a resigned sort of nod. "Wonderful." Wesley pulled a notepad from his suit pocket and slowly located a pen. "Could you tell me a bit about Dr. McCann?" "Well, as I told your partner, Cullen was very well respected. Patients liked him. He was an expert at laparoscopic surgery. He did a lot of mastectomies." "So he treated cancer patients?" She nodded. "A lot of women owe him their lives." Despite her description of the late surgeon, Brenda's tone was clipped and frosty. Wesley couldn't tell if it was her annoyance with him or contempt for Dr. McCann that he was detecting. Throwing caution to the wind, Wesley said, "It sounds as though you may have felt differently about Dr. McCann." Brenda's eyebrows knitted together, and her mouth tightened into a line. It seemed that Wesley was on the right track, though she didn't want to admit it. "Please, Miss Stokes." "Brenda, anything you can tell us could help us solve this case." He almost added expeditiously to entice the overstressed administrator, but that was always a gross exaggeration when it came to police work. Brenda nodded slowly, seeming to decide it was for the best. Cullen was popular with patients and colleagues, but decidedly less popular with the rest of the staff. Like all surgeons, he had an ego, and he sometimes acted as though he ran the place. He snapped at the nurses. He was a terror to the residents. He treated the techs like garbage. Now they were getting somewhere. "Anyone in particular?" Wesley asked. Brenda gave him a deadpan look. "I have a file this thick full of complaints from nurses." She held her fingers an inch apart. "I'll need to have a look at that," said Wesley. "But do you know if he had a conflict with anyone who was working last night when he was on call?" "Cullen wasn't on call last night." "He wasn't?" Brenda shook her head. "Why didn't you share this with Detective Watts?" Brenda hesitated for a moment, but then let out a heavy sigh. "I didn't want to draw attention to it. I didn't think it was relevant, and I don't want to risk this getting out. It's not fair to Cullen's family to tarnish his reputation when—" "Miss Stokes, if you have information about Dr. McCann, it could help us identify his killer." "I doubt that, but if you must know—" She stared up at the ceiling with a look of reluctance. "I had an inkling that he might be stealing." "Stealing?" "Yes." Wesley could tell she didn't want to talk about it, lest her suspicions prove false. "We've recently had quite a few blood bags go missing," she said. more than could have been attributed to simple error. It started about 18 months ago, right around the time Cullen joined our staff. When this started happening, we altered our policies to limit access to the lab and take more frequent inventory. The thefts didn't stop. I cross-checked the records of everyone who had access during those periods of time. Cullen was the only commonality. Why would McCann be stealing blood bags? Unfortunately, the black market organ trade is still thriving worldwide. In this country, that means black market transplants, most of which require blood transfusions. Wesley raised an eyebrow. You think McCann was involved in the black market organ trade? I wouldn't go as far as that. I only know about the blood that's gone missing from my hospital since he started working here. Did you ask him about it? What could I say? I didn't have any proof, and I couldn't risk pissing off the best surgeon I had. Just then, a man in polyester slacks and a baggy black security jacket walked through the front doors. He looked remarkably cool and collected for someone who'd been working security when a murder was committed. Maybe nobody had bothered to tell him why he was being called into work. That's Roy Wilson, said Brenda, one of the guards on duty last night. He would have been working the desk when the footage was deleted. It was a mark of how beat down Wesley felt that he called up Gabe after he finished at the crime scene. They had questioned every witness they could reach about the surgeon's death, and he put out a few calls regarding the tip that the good doctor might have been involved in the black market organ trade. The security guard had been a dead end. He hadn't remembered anything odd about his shift, and he claimed not to know how the footage had been deleted. Wesley believed him. Roy Wilson had worn a glassy expression behind his small, mud-colored eyes. Wesley suspected he wasn't the brightest bulb in the box, but his instincts told him the guard wasn't involved in a cover-up. More likely, the killer had drawn the guard away from his post and deleted the footage herself. Wesley didn't think he could stomach the whiff of alcohol, so he and Gabe were meeting at the Silver Bullet shooting range. Gabriel enjoyed his weapons much more than Wesley did, but Wesley had been glad for the suggestion. Target shooting always helped him clear his head, and it kept him sharp in the field. The Silver Bullet was housed in a shabby brick building across from a payday loans place. There was a gas station on one side and a laundromat on the other. The giant head of a bald eagle glared down at Wesley from the side of the building. It was painted over the brick facade with a rendering of an American flag. Gabe was leaning against his car when Wesley pulled up in his truck. "You look like hell." "Thanks to you," said Wesley, leaning into the back seat to get his long gun and ammunition. "Don't blame me because you're a lightweight. You've always been a bad influence." Gabriel waggled his eyebrows and pulled the door open. They stepped inside the grungy lobby, which was dominated by a long glass case of pistols. Different colored boxes of ammo lined the shelf behind the counter, and dozens of rifles hung on the wall. The man at the counter was helping another customer, so they hung back to talk. "Since you called me up 2 nights in a row, I'm guessing you're in need of a little more of my tutelage." Wesley flashed a wry grin and clapped his brother on the back. He wasn't going to give Gabe the satisfaction of admitting he was right. It's just nice to blow off some steam every once in a while. They paid their range fees and walked to their lane, and Wesley's troubles seemed to dissolve. The volley of shots echoing down the long concrete walls drowned out his thoughts, and the power reverberating down his arm seemed to center him. As he stepped back from the line to reload, he glanced over at Gabe. Wesley only had his service weapons and a few of their father's he kept for sentimental value, but Gabriel had a couple dozen firearms that he used on a rotating basis. He didn't open carry in public, but Wesley knew that his brother kept a pistol in the glove box and had weapons concealed all around his apartment. Wesley had always thought he was paranoid, but the darkest corners of his imagination didn't hold a candle to Gabe's. Today, Gabe was shooting his Colt Python with a custom wooden grip. It was a .357 Magnum revolver that looked as though it belonged in an old Western. "What is it?" Gabriel asked, pulling his earmuffs down. He was still wearing the plastic safety goggles, which was an odd look for Gabe. Wesley sighed. "I got called in on another homicide. Same MO as the last." "You think it's a serial killer?" "Technically, she would be considered a spree killer. The homicides are too close together." "So the killer is a woman?" "Yep." Wesley tucked his Glock back into his holster and pressed the button to bring his paper forward. Most of the shots were cleanly within the rectangle at center mass. He knew Gabe's groupings would be just as tight. He tore the paper down and put up a fresh one before opening the case for his long gun. "So you find out how she chooses her victims, and then you find your killer." "That's the trouble," said Wesley. "I still have no idea what the victims had in common. They're in different lines of work, they live in different parts of the city, they went to different gyms. So far, I haven't found anything that links them, apart from their age and sex. You will, said Gabe in a reassuring voice. Wesley appreciated the vote of confidence, but it didn't ease his mind. Gabriel watched Wesley load the long gun, a hungry look in his eyes. Wesley knew he'd been eyeing the AR-556 at the counter. Maybe he'd let Gabe shoot his. It could be anything that links them, right? Asked Gabe. A bank or a grocery store? I suppose. What about after work? I'm guessing the surgeon played a lot of golf. No idea, said Wesley, leaning his rifle on the table and staring through the sights. I'm still waiting on the Vic's credit card statements. That should tell us something. He motioned for Gabriel to put his earmuffs back on and unload a clip into the target. The earmuffs protected his ears, but the shot still reverberated through his ribcage. Wesley straightened up. Come to think of it, the surgeon did have a stamp on the inside of his wrist. It looked like a skeleton key. You ever see a stamp like that? Gabriel was more familiar with the nightlife scene than he was. Gabe shook his head slowly, but his eyes looked distant. Well, it's a start. That and the missing blood bags. Blood bags? Gabriel broke in sharply. Yeah. The hospital administrators at Rose Medical said they've had quite a few go missing, ever since the surgeon started working there. Gabriel nodded, brows drawn together, and Wesley knew he wasn't imagining the slightly frantic look in his eyes. What is it? He asked, studying his brother more carefully. But Gabriel just cracked a grin. Nothing. I think I want to try that AR they had up front. See if I can do better than you. Chapter 4. Gabriel. Just a few hours after I left Wesley, I pulled up at the back room. Neon lights from nearby bars reflected off my tinted windows, and I saw the bouncer eye my car warily as I parked along the curb. A minimalist rendering of a skeleton key was the only sign outside the club. The entrance was a single door painted black, tucked around the corner. The back room was one of those spots that was designed to be an open secret, but everyone on the bar scene knew about it. It had been years since I visited. The back room wasn't my kind of place. The drinks were wildly overpriced, and there were far too many dark corners for supernaturals to lurk in. It wasn't really a draw for the sort of people I hunted, but witches and vamps had been known to turn up, and a hunter could never be too careful. I'd realized this was the place after Wesley had mentioned the stamp. I watched the bouncer roll an identical smudged key onto my wrist in black ink before grunting that I was free to go in. Unless there was some other bar that used the same stamp, the victim had likely been there the night he was killed. Inside, the club was a bluish haze of shadow and skin. A blue strip of neon light reflected off the shiny black bar top, and all the lights over the booths had matching shades made from translucent blue glass. Girls in skimpy dresses lounged in tufted leather booths on the main floor, while men watched them over the curved railing of the second-floor balcony. Techno music rattled my bones as I sidled up to the bar, searching for anyone who looked like they might be a vamp. Normally I would have been able to sense a vampire, but a crowded club like this one was the perfect cloaking device for any supernatural hoping to fly under my radar. There was too much ether in the air from the mortals to pick out anything distinct, even the ether black hole that vampires were. The dim bluish light made everyone look pale, so identifying one by sight wasn't likely. I slid onto a stool at the very end of the bar, where I was decidedly ignored by the sexy female bartender filling a line of shots for a bachelorette group. She was tattooed, pierced, and wearing a skimpy low-cut top. The bored look on her face told me she'd been at this for a while. "Excuse me," I said, leaning across the bar top as the bachelorette strutted off. "What can I get you?" she asked, not looking up as she mopped the shiny service of the bar to clean up the tequila. "Have you seen this man in here?" I asked, holding up my phone. The waitress gave a reluctant sigh and bent across the bar to look. The whitish glow of my screen reflected in her big brown eyes. They were heavily made up with thick black eyeliner, and I saw that she had a rhinestone stud piercing through her meticulously penciled eyebrow. "I don't think so," she said, making a duck face. I knew she didn't want to get involved, but I felt fairly confident that she was telling the truth. I swiped to the right. "What about this guy?" The photo of the surgeon took over my screen, and the bartender studied him longer. I'd managed to swipe the pictures off of Wesley's phone when he'd gone out to buy another carton of ammunition. It was risky, trying to get ahead of him on this, But if a vampire was responsible for those killings, I needed to take care of her before Wesley got too close. "Sorry," said the bartender, eyeing me with distrust. "You a cop or something?" "Something like that," I said. "I'm asking because one of the victims was found with the backroom stamp on him. I thought he might have been here the night he was killed." "What night was that?" "I usually only work Saturdays and Wednesdays." "I don't know. Probably Thursday or Friday." "Shelley sometimes works on Friday," she said, turning to look toward the pretty blonde waitress serving drinks at one of the booths. When Shelley straightened up, my tattooed bartender waved her over. Shelley took her sweet-ass time approaching the bar, and I had to wonder what she thought this was about. She was quite a bit older than the tattooed bartender, but still extremely pretty. I could see the creases in the corners of her eyes, but they had a youthful kind of sparkle that some women never lose. "Shelley," said the bartender. "Angel," I think her tag said. "Were you working Friday?" "Yeah," said Shelley, smacking her gum and giving me an appraising look. "He's a cop," said Angel. "He's looking for info on these guys." I didn't bother to correct her. I just held up the phone so Shelley could get a closer look. "Nah," said Shelley. "He came in on Friday?" "Most likely," I said. "What about this guy?" Shelley squinted at my phone, but then shook her head. In that moment, I couldn't tell whether or not she was being truthful. There was something behind those big, made-up eyes. I could see that she was the sort of woman who kept her true thoughts hidden under a charming and agreeable persona. Seeing that I wasn't going to get any information, I tucked my phone back into my pocket. "Thank you for your help, ladies," I said, reaching out to pin Shelley's wrist to the bar top and looking deep into her eyes. "Now you will forget that I was ever here, asking about these men." Larimer Tavern was about the farthest thing from the back room in presentation and clientele. It was a squatty dive bar in Golden with a window AC unit rattling along the side of the building. A single strip of red neon lit a white banner advertising $2 pints. The other side of the building was taken up by smudgy windows streaked with the rainbow lights of beer signs. At the corner was a red brick entrance. The generic neon bar sign over the door was burnt out on one side. I had no business being over there. Larimer Tavern was north of I-70, and the highway denoted the boundary where my territory ended and Kane's began. I didn't have the authority to pursue supernaturals up there unless I could prove they reside in my jurisdiction. Territorial disputes got more hunters killed than witches, werewolves, and vampires combined. But Larimer Tavern was the only place I was sure to run into Kilgore. Vampires weren't big on sharing their home addresses with hunters, even when you had a decent working relationship. They didn't trust us any more than we trusted them, and we both had good reason. Stepping inside, I was assaulted by the scent of stale beer, burnt popcorn, and hot dogs. Bottles of flavored liquor and smudged glasses gleamed behind the sticky laminate bar top, and the chalkboard over the bar advertised pictures of Pabst Blue Ribbon for just $5. A sign behind the cash register read, "Prices subject to change according to customers' attitude." One only had to glance around at the tavern's surly clientele to guess why that sign was there. Half a dozen pairs of shifty eyes followed me as I made my way down the bar. They were mostly gritty and middle-aged, but there were a few 30-somethings in T-shirts and trucker hats. Lucky for me, Kilgore was seated at the far end of the bar. He was hunched and very pale, with hair the color of mop water sticking out from around his ears. Dressed in a pair of old Levi's and a brown bomber jacket, he looked like any other guy in there. He didn't look up as I approached, but I knew he'd been aware of my presence since I'd parked my car. Vampires were extremely sensitive to a hunter's ether. They could pick us out of a crowd from half a mile away. Kilgore was what his kind liked to call an ethical vampire, meaning he drank from humans who either gave their consent or had their memories wiped afterward. He never drank enough to kill his victims, and the ether in his venom healed the bite marks instantly. I had no way of verifying this. I just had to take his word for it. Barring any suspicious deaths or mortals raving about blood-sucking vampires, there was no way to prosecute ethical vamps for feeding. "Kilgore," I said, dropping onto the bar stool beside him. Kilgore was drinking dark beer from a filthy glass, but I knew it wasn't doing much to quench his thirst. "What do you want, Pierce?" he asked, staring up at the TV mounted behind the bar. An MMA fight was playing on screen, and one of the fighters' faces was swollen and bloody. "Need a favor." Always a favor, said Kilgore, throwing back his beer and swallowing with a look of distaste. I decided to ignore this. I had known Kilgore since he'd lived in that shithole trailer near Idaho Springs. When he moved to Golden and stumbled into Kane's territory, he'd had some trouble. I'd stepped in and kept him off Kane's hit list, so the vampire owed me big time. 2 dead bodies turned up this week. Looks a lot like a vampire did it. Kilgore's head swiveled in my direction, fixing me with a flinty gaze. What makes you so sure? Both men were found with their necks broken mid-coitus. One of the victims is linked to some blood bags that went missing from a hospital. I'm thinking he was some vamp's pet before she got sick of him. Were they drained? Asked Kilgore. Drained? The bodies? No, not that I heard. Kilgore made a non-committal noise in the back of his throat. Seems to me you're just hoping a vampire did it. Kilgore. He and I both knew that, subtle as they were, the odd circumstances of the deaths pointed to a vampire. Kilgore drained his beer and signaled the bartender for another pint. He was purposely avoiding my gaze, which usually meant he knew more than he was telling. I started to grow impatient. If these killings continue, the Brotherhood is going to crack down on every vamp in Denver. People notice when white-collar men start turning up dead. If they decide to bring another hunter into my territory, it's going to be bad news for all your friends. Your threats are no good here, Kilgore grumbled, though I could tell my words had had their intended effect. I waited. I knew he was on the verge of telling me. I just had to be patient. I heard someone was raising a new clan somewhere over in Hilltop. That could explain the missing blood bags. At those words, I felt a tingle of excitement mixed with dread. Creating new vampires was strictly forbidden. The Brotherhood had taken it upon themselves to create and enforce that law, and centuries of pitting magical beings against one another effectively prevented any one species from challenging their authority. One reason for the ban was that new vampires increased the demand for blood, and they were dangerous. A freshly turned vampire had an insatiable thirst, and when they sank their fangs into warm human flesh, it was all they could do to avoid killing the mortal. Still, there were plenty of traditionalists in the vampire community who didn't recognize the Brotherhood's authority. The few who were ballsy enough to create new vamps in secret usually did so by nursing their new brood on blood bags. It was the vampire equivalent of canned food, but it helped new vampires learn self-control until they mellowed enough to feed on the living. Where in Hilltop? I asked. I needed to cut the clan off at the head, which meant finding the new vamp's sire. Kilgore shook his head. How should I know? Because you vampires gossip like old ladies at a knitting circle. Kilgore didn't say anything. If you won't tell me, I might let it slip to Kane how that homeless man turned up dead last winter. All right. Just because Kilgore was an ethical vamp didn't mean he never slipped up. The clan's on one of those tree streets, I think. Cherry, maybe elm. Who's making them? I don't know. All I heard is they've been getting out at night lately. I know a few who've seen them around. I let out a growl. A new clan was like black mold to a hunter. It could often grow for years before the problem was discovered, and once you found it, it was hell to get rid of. As for the stiffs, Kilgore continued, that sounds like Letitia's work. Who's Letitia? Just a bad vamp making a splash. I've never met her, but I've heard she likes the taste of men, and that she's got a bit of a violent streak. I'd heard that vampires had certain preferences. A lot of vamps targeted women, either because they preferred women sexually or because they were smaller and therefore easier to handle. But I'd heard from more than one vamp that young women were more prone to anemia, which meant their blood didn't taste as rich. She's one of those new wave night supremacists. Kilgore raised an eyebrow. Handle with care. I rolled my eyes and fell silent as the bartender drifted off. I knew I shouldn't stay for a drink, but I was quickly losing motivation to hunt down this clan. If Letitia was a night supremacist, there was a good chance she had sired the new clan. Night supremacists considered vampires to be a superior species, so they believed in creating as many new vamps as possible. They were also prolific feeders who thought they had a right to kill mortals simply because they are more powerful. In other words, they were bad news. Bourbon, I said to the bartender, not offering any specifics. I figured the top-shelf liquor would be limited in that place. You planning on staking her? Asked Kilgore. I will if I find out she's sired a whole soccer team of vamps, or that she's the one who killed those mortals. Short of ripping a vampire's heart out, staking one through the heart and burying its body was the best way to get rid of one. A wooden stake wasn't foolproof. Sometimes it just grazed the heart, but it did prevent a vampire from reanimating until it was removed. Burying the vampire in an unmarked grave was the safest way to make sure nobody tried to bring the vampire back. Good luck, said Kilgore, shaking his head. Letitia's been staked a couple of times before, and she's out for hunter blood. How old is she? Old, from what I hear. I knew from experience that old was a relative term, but the older the vamp, the harder to stake. They weren't as fast or strong as newly turned vampires, but they had been around the block long enough not to fall for any of a hunter's usual tricks. If Letitia was 200+ years old, she'd be tough to take down alone. Well, if you run into Letitia, you and I don't know each other. The bartender brought me my drink, and I took a sip. Scared? You'd be stupid not to be. Chapter 5. Gabriel. The sun was setting by the time I pulled up at the hotel resort and convention center. It was the perfect Las Vegas night, warm and dry, with a slight breeze that caused the palm trees to sway dreamily. The Brotherhood had closed down the entire resort for the weekend's events. It was a feat I was sure had required gobs of cash and the power of suggestion. Usually, the equinox shindigs weren't as elaborate as the ones held at the spring and winter solstice, but it appeared the Brotherhood had outdone itself. The hotel was enormous and shamelessly decadent. A man-made canal flowed through one side of the building, which towered over the glowing skyline. 2 guys in suits were stationed just outside the marble-floored lobby, ready to turn away any mortals or supernaturals who might have an inkling to crash the party. The sign out front had advertised some fake B2B trade show being held that weekend, but you never knew who might show up. The solstice gatherings were members only, but the equinox events were open to all hunters, even those who hadn't taken an oath. While the Brotherhood of Kincardineshire claimed that these conventions were designed to keep their members up to date on the latest techniques, they really served 3 purposes: to dazzle unaffiliated hunters with swanky accommodations and perks, to engender goodwill among pledged members, and to keep tabs on the more elusive hunters and ensure our loyalty. Banners emblazoned with the wheel of the hunt hung from the sweeping white pillars I passed, and I caught sight of a few familiar faces as I checked in and gave my luggage to a bellhop. I seldom attended the equinox events, but I'd come to gather information about the new clan. I'd used up all my goodwill in the vampire community, and sometimes other hunters heard things. I felt the rhythmic throb of bass before I even reached the convention hall. I walked through a set of double doors and found my path blocked by 2 scantily clad mortal waitresses. 95% of hunters were men, which explained the choice of help. I took an acid green shot from the tray one was holding and dutifully tossed it back. I hissed as the sour apple flavor hit the back of my throat. At least the drinks were free. As I walked into the first room, I was blinded by dancing laser beams. The latest model Kawasaki Ninja H2 was spinning on a giant turntable, illuminated by a blue spotlight. A cityscape was projected onto the wall behind it, and a pretty brunette model in a pleather vest and shorts gestured to the motorcycle and beamed. I kept walking into the cavernous main room, which had been transformed into a maze of booths. Hundreds of mortal vendors turned out for these things, only to return home with a sudden spike in sales and no memory of how they'd gotten them. They were showing off the latest and greatest hunter toys: crossbows, firearms, motorcycles, sports cars, swords, silver daggers, and throwing stars. My eyes lingered on a state-of-the-art home forge for making custom weapons and ammo. On the main stage, a bald, muscular man was demoing a tactical repeating crossbow on Halloweenish dummies of vampires and werewolves. I needed one of those. Sound effects of screams and blood splatters boomed over the loudspeakers, causing abandoned glasses on the tables to vibrate. I rolled my eyes and took a flaming shot from a waitress dressed like a warrior princess. This one made the inside of my chest burn, but left a pleasant cinnamony aftertaste. The boom of a portable trunk cannon to my left made me jump back so fast that I almost crashed into a table. The hunters who ran these things seemed to enjoy the challenge of seeing just how big they could go without exposing our world. Over the last 500 years, there had been a steady decline in mortals' beliefs in all things supernatural. Most people think the Enlightenment was the final nail in the coffin, but the Industrial Revolution is actually what did it. Every technological advancement, from the steam engine to the automobile, brought more people to the dark corners of the map. Many magical creatures died out or were hunted to near extinction. With them gone, hunters seemed unnecessary at best, dangerous at worst. We went underground in the mid-1800s, and it's been that way ever since. Making my way around the room, I kept an eye out for people I knew. The Brotherhood pulled hunters from all over North America and Europe, and most of us touched down in Vegas a few weekends a year. I scanned the oversized itinerary post in the aisle. Supercharge your bounty earnings. Pass. How to kill 3 wares with 1 bullet. Tactical plans for clans and packs. Pass. Long haul hunting. Know the code before you track in another hunter's territory. I shook my head. It was as if they ran the same sessions year after year under different names. Some of the tactical training sessions were fun to participate in, but those were always held first thing in the morning, before the attendees started drinking. Over by the bar, I caught sight of a familiar face and felt my blood quicken. She was probably the only woman in the room who wasn't a waitress or an auto show model, but nobody else seemed to have noticed her. The woman had a blunt bob of dark auburn hair that glowed copper and gold under the bar lights. She wore a pair of tight jeans that hugged every curve, and she was tapping the side of the bar with the toe of her boot. In the shadow cast by her brown leather jacket, I could just make out the handle of her sidearm. Morgan collected firearms like some women collected shoes. She was sitting alone, nursing a drink. That was my cue to approach. Downing another shot from a circulating tray, I sidled over to the bar and slid into the stool beside her. Morgan Flanders. Morgan turned, not looking surprised. It was next to impossible to sneak up on Morgan. Her eyes were an unusual greenish amber color, and they twinkled as the corner of her mouth lifted in a friendly smirk. Gabriel Pierce, as I live and breathe. I waggled my eyebrows. Still living, still breathing. That's more than I can say for some of the young upstarts who were here last year. You gotta thin the herd somehow. We can't all be hotshots like you. I see they really amped up the testosterone to compensate for your appalling numbers last quarter, said Morgan. I ignored this little dig at the Brotherhood. Morgan hadn't taken any oath, but she was as much a fixture at the Equinox events as any of the pledged members. There was no love lost between Morgan and the Brotherhood, but she showed up at these things twice a year to stay sharp and network. You look good, I said, since she hadn't acknowledged my first compliment. She looked better than good. She was smoking hot. Morgan had the sort of figure that all women wanted and a dark beauty mark over her lip. She flashed a smile. So do you. Wood for reserve on the rocks, I said to the bartender. The bartender pulled out a glass and gave a generous pour. I hear you've got a pretty active new clan on your hands, said Morgan conversationally. I frowned. All those vampire killings up near Denver? Segways never were your thing. Isn't that your territory? Morgan asked casually. Yeah, but I'm only aware of 2 killings so far. It hadn't even been a week since I'd last seen Wesley. Surely I'd have heard if there had been more murders. Morgan rolled her bottom lip in a half blasé, half smug expression. I heard there were 4 in the last month. 1 in Aurora and 1 in Boulder. I hadn't heard. I squinted at her. Who's your source? Not that I doubted her intel. Morgan was good. If she'd been a pledged member instead of a freelancer, she would have made more in bonuses than most hunters made in bounties. Morgan shrugged. You just hear things when you're out on the road. What sort of things? I asked, a slight edge to my voice. Morgan gave me a sideways look. Nothing like that, she assured me. Just that they're thinking of bringing another hunter into your territory. The population out there has exploded. You can't be expected to round up all those supernaturals on your own." I grimaced. Morgan wasn't wrong. The legalization of marijuana had sparked a boom in Colorado that had brought unprecedented growth to the area. It was impossible to know exact figures on the number of supernaturals in a city, but one could estimate that it was about 1% of the total population. There were proportionally more mortals than there had been 10 years prior, but overcrowded cities and more people encroaching on their natural habitats meant more clashes between mortals and supernaturals. When you factored in the rate of deviant magic per capita, my territory was right on the cusp of needing another hunter. But I didn't like to share. "I'll tell you what I know," I said cautiously. Morgan's eyes gleamed with a lively curiosity. She'd never shown this much interest in me, even in bed, and I couldn't resist feeding into something that so clearly intrigued her. "There's a vampire called Letitia who's killed a couple of mortals," I said. "She's old guard, dangerous, and a night supremacist." Morgan's eyes grew wide. "Is she the one siring all those new vampires?" I held back a groan. I didn't even want to ask how Morgan knew about the Hilltop clan. Apparently, word had gotten around. I blamed Kane. He would have loved for the Brotherhood to send another hunter into my territory. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm looking into it." I had been looking into it, until I'd been pulled away to deal with some ghouls that were laying waste to a military cemetery. "Damn, Pierce," said Morgan, stretching back against the bar stool and smiling like the Cheshire cat. "If I didn't know any better, I'd say you were losing your touch." "Careful now," I said, my gaze lingering on her lips, "or I won't be able to leave here tonight until you revised your opinion of me." As it turned out, neither of us would be making it to any of the convention sessions that evening. 5 minutes later, we were in the elevator, headed up to my room. I had Morgan pressed against the wall opposite the doors, partially so I could press my body against hers, and partly to keep her pinned. Her skilled fingers had my shirt half unbuttoned before we'd even made it to my floor, and I wanted to wait until we had some privacy before she stripped me naked. Luckily, no one boarded the elevator between the 30th and 40th floors. She'd already managed to get my shirt undone, and my belt buckle was hanging loose from my belt loops. Gripping her ass through her tight jeans, I steered her out of the elevator and down the hall. Morgan let out a soft gasp as I pushed her against the wall and fumbled in my pocket for a room key. Most hunters I knew smelled like whiskey and gunpowder, but Morgan smelled like coconut shampoo. I swore as she pressed her hips into mine and pulled me tighter against her. The stupid card reader wasn't working. It kept beeping and turning red while Morgan nipped at my neck. I had her sandwiched between me and the door, and I was having trouble timing the card withdrawal as her fingers traveled south. Mercifully, the light blinked green, and I shoved my way into the room. Morgan shuffled back on her heels, slamming into the full-length mirror hanging on the inside wall. The room had golden beige wallpaper and white crown molding that matched the crisp white bed linens. "This is the last time we're doing this," Morgan breathed as I tugged her jacket down over her arms. Underneath, she wore a black zip, corset-style top and an underarm gun holster. I laughed into the little indent where her jawline met her neck. "You say that every year." "I mean it every year," said Morgan as she pulled off my jacket and shirt. "You aren't even my type." But her expression said something different as she studied me against the mirror. Her greenish amber eyes seemed to glow like a cat's, and I sensed a hunger in her so strong that I could practically taste it. She dove in to lick me nipple to clavicle, and I suppressed an involuntary shudder. I fumbled with her holster. She was packing a little Glock Nano against her breast, right above the full-sized version. I carefully removed them both before tossing them onto the tufted beige love seat. "And what is your type?" "Nice guys." "I can be nice," I protested, my abdominals tightening as she unzipped my fly. Morgan chuckled against my mouth, and I pulled her hips into mine. "We're too much alike," she murmured, deftly removing my concealed pistol from the holster inside my pants. In one swift motion, I unzipped her top. Underneath, she wore a see-through mesh bra that gave me an unobstructed view of her breasts. I could name a few key differences, I breathed. Normally, I wouldn't let another hunter see me so unguarded, but I trusted Morgan, as much as one could trust a rival hunter. In any case, we were both breathing hard, and Morgan's smooth, athletic body quivered at my touch. Bending down on one knee, I pried my gaze away from her hard little nipples that were pressing through the black mesh. Her head fell back in a peal of wild laughter, and I took the opportunity to grab her around the hips and toss her onto the king-size bed. She landed with a bounce and another musical laugh, kicking off her boots. She had a silver dagger holstered at her ankle, and I removed this carefully before peeling off her socks and jeans. The sight of her splayed beneath me in nothing but a see-through bra and a pair of equally see-through panties was almost more than I could stand. Stumbling out of my own jeans, I lay down between her thighs and looked up into her face. She was watching me with a slight challenge in her eyes, which had taken on a stronger golden hue against the beigey backdrop of the wallpaper. "Still think I've lost my touch?" She grinned, and I realized how much I liked the little beauty mark, setting off her smirk. "That remains to be seen." Moving like a wolf stalking its prey, I ran a finger over her through her panties and then ripped them off in a flash. I heard a sharp intake of breath as I teased her, cupping her thighs with my hands to spread her open more. She squirmed beneath me, and I could see her stomach clenching and releasing as she rocked her hips against me. I licked and caressed until I was sure she was nearly there. Then I stopped, looked up, and managed to gasp, "What's your interest in the vampire killings?" Morgan raised her head off the covers, fixing me with a murderous look. Her lips jutted forward in a vengeful pout, and those feline eyes could have cut glass. Seeing that she wasn't going to answer me, I gave her an admonishing look and slid up her body until our noses touched. She held my gaze with a stubborn glare, but I could see the longing in her eyes. Slowly, I let myself slide inside her, and Morgan arched her spine. Her head fell back, revealing the long line of her throat and chin. My forearm shook as I slid in deeper, and all my curiosity seemed to melt away. But I knew this was my best chance to get some answers, so I planted a trail of soft kisses down her throat. "Why did you ask me about the vampires?" I asked, punctuating my words with a thrust. But Morgan just lifted her hips to meet mine, and I ground my back molars together. My vision blurred as I stared down at her, awash in the golden light from the lamp. I wasn't going to win this one. Her breasts quivered with every thrust, and I desperately wanted to see them free. Reaching behind me, I took up Morgan's silver dagger and carefully removed it from the sheath. A jolt of fear and ecstasy flashed through her eyes as I lowered it to her sternum. The knife cut through the flimsy fabric easily, and I dipped my head to bite her nipple. She squirmed beneath me, hooked a leg around my waist, and pushed me onto my back. My head hit the bed, and I forgot to breathe as I stared up at Morgan straddling me. She seemed to forget who I was as she tilted her head back and rolled her hips. Her nails dug into the flesh at my chest, and it was all I could do to let her finish before I exploded into 1,000 pieces. She threw her leg over and collapsed beside me, her chest rising and falling rhythmically. We'd been in sync only a second before, but the cadence of our breathing was now almost reversed. A warm flush colored her cheeks, and she looked uncharacteristically soft for a moment. I realized belatedly that she'd won. She still hadn't told me about her interest in the vampires. "See," she said, turning to look at me, "you are not a nice guy." "How am I not a nice guy?" "Nice guys don't interrogate girls during sex." This was just a friendly conversation between colleagues. Morgan laughed and rolled her eyes. Colleagues? Friends? I might have felt bad about it if Morgan wasn't so clearly amused. We'd always been better friends than lovers. Nothing had changed in the 8 years I'd known her, and a hunter's lifestyle wasn't conducive to serious relationships anyway. "What do you want?" I asked. "For me to weep after sex and throw rose petals at your feet?" I could do without the weeping, but rose petals might be nice. "How about chocolate?" Morgan glared at me suspiciously, so I got up and went to my suitcase. I unzipped the top and withdrew a small white box wrapped in shimmering gold ribbon. I tossed it onto her lap. Inside were dark chocolate peanut butter buckets from the Rocky Mountain Chocolate Factory. They were basically giant peanut butter cups, and they were Morgan's favorite. She opened the box and smelled them carefully, as though she were sniffing for poison. "You trying to butter me up, Pierce?" "I'm always trying to butter you up." Morgan rolled her eyes, and I could tell that the pillow talk portion of the evening was over. She sat up quickly and threw her legs over the bed, fiddling with her corset top. I watched her move around the room collecting clothes and weapons, feeling the premature sting of loneliness. Once she had her jeans back on and the baby Glock wedged under her boob, she turned to me with that familiar, mischievous look. "If it's any consolation, Pierce, you haven't lost your touch." Chapter 6. Wesley. The club was still mostly empty by the time Gabriel showed up. He sauntered in wearing jeans and a t-shirt, not bothering to conceal his derisive expression. Wesley had been slightly surprised that Gabe had agreed to meet him at a nightclub at 9 o'clock on a Monday. But lately, when Wesley called, Gabe showed up. It was almost as though his brother missed him. The back room was exactly the sort of place that Gabriel normally wouldn't have been caught dead. The drinks were overpriced, the club tried too hard to be cool, and the regular crowd skewed young and shallow. If it was possible to be pretentious about pretension, Gabe could walk that line. He always drank the most expensive liquor, but he rolled his eyes any time someone brought up a wine's mouthfeel or homemade bitters. "What's with the belt buckle?" Gabe asked, as soon as he joined Wesley at the bar. Wesley was wearing the broad silver Thunderbird buckle that their dad had bought in Gallup, New Mexico. "Trying out a look," he said with a shrug. Gabriel gave him an appraising look, taking in Wesley's blue button-up, dark jeans, and cognac leather boots. He gave an approving nod. "Looks good." "Thanks," said Wesley, slightly relieved. Part of him had been worried that he'd never live down the night he'd shown up to the club wearing the old Navajo belt buckle. To Wesley, it seemed that his brother never had to try very hard, and that he always seemed to show up in the correct attire. While most of the other guys there were wearing nice jeans, collared shirts, and even sport coats, the girls sitting at the table just behind them followed Gabe with their eyes. "Why did you want to meet here?" he asked, eyeing the attractive tattooed bartender. "I got a lead," said Wesley. "The surgeon who was murdered had this club stamp on his wrist, which means someone here saw him just before he died." "So?" said Gabriel, trying to signal the bartender. "So I still haven't found anything that links the two victims. This could be the place." "Do you think these killings are related to the ones in Aurora and Boulder?" Gabriel asked. Wesley stared. He was certain he hadn't told Gabe about the other homicides. He'd only just discovered the link himself a few days before, when they'd gotten a hit on the killer's DNA. The woman's DNA had been found on 2 other bodies, though they still didn't have an ID. "How did you know about those cases?" he asked, careful not to raise his voice loud enough for the other patrons to hear. Gabriel shrugged, but avoided his gaze. "I was curious, so I did a quick search. I thought they looked pretty similar to yours." Wesley nodded, but he had the strange feeling that Gabriel wasn't telling him the truth. He wasn't sure what kind of internet query would have brought up those particular cases. The police had tried to keep the more salacious details out of the papers. He wasn't sure the articles even mentioned that they'd been found half-dressed. Still, Gabe was right. The homicides were remarkably similar. Both had been men in their late 30s at the top of their fields, found with their spinal cords severed. One of the victims had founded some hot new startup and had been featured on Fortune's 40 Under 40 list. The other had been the president of a medical group. The only thing missing were the ligature marks, though it was possible the killer had only recently started strangling her victims. Another bartender, a smiling redhead, came over to take Gabe's drink order. He ordered something called Widow Jane, still watching the tattooed bartender out of the corner of his eye. "You think the killer is a regular here?" he asked. Wesley gave a non-committal tilt of his head. So far, he had nothing linking the other victims to the club, but if he could find a witness who'd seen Dr. McCann that night, he might get a lead on a potential suspect. At the very least, it would help him paint a picture of the victim's final days. "I've been coming here every night since Friday," he said. "I'm hoping I can get the owner to talk to me." "Who's that?" Gabriel asked. Lucian Alexander? Wesley had already checked out Mr. Alexander. He'd come back clean. A little too clean. The man didn't even have a speeding ticket, which was odd in itself for a club owner. The type of men who owned nightlight spots like the Backroom rarely reached the age of 40 without any drug offenses, DWIs, or misdemeanor assault charges. As if on cue, Wesley spotted a good-looking black man in a nice charcoal suit working his way across the room. He was tall and lean with a neat goatee, and he wore his hair shorn very close to the scalp. The man stopped every now and then to greet patrons and shake their hands. It had to be Lucian Alexander. Gabriel looked over his shoulder, and Alexander's gaze flickered over to the brothers. He was still leaning in to hear what a woman in one of the far booths was saying, but Wesley knew he was aware of their presence. By the time the bartender had brought Gabriel his drink, Alexander was making his way over. You must be Detective Pierce, he said, his voice low and subdued, but still oddly welcoming. Lucian Alexander, owner and proprietor. Wesley held out a hand and cracked a smile. Is it that obvious? Lucian flashed a set of very white teeth. I know a cop when I see one, Detective. Please, call me Wesley, said Wes, shaking his hand. This is my brother, Gabriel. Nice to meet you, said Lucian. The pleasure's all mine. But Lucian's lip curled in a way that made Wesley think he and Gabe knew one another. Rachel, would you get the detective a refill? Lucian asked the red-headed bartender as she wiped down the counter. On the house. Wesley smiled, but didn't let his guard down. Lucian Alexander was polished and likable, but Wesley had dealt with men like him before. Wealthy club owners went out of their way to be helpful and generous, but their cooperation tended to dry up the second a case jeopardized their interests. I apologize that I couldn't make myself available sooner, said Lucian, running a thumb down his suit jacket and unbuttoning it. I was away dealing with some supply chain issues. My manager said that you had some questions. Yes, said Wesley, clearing his throat. It was odd conducting an interview with Gabriel present. I'm sure you've seen it in the papers. 2 men were recently murdered. Lucian gave a solemn nod. Eric Peckman and Dr. McCann, was it? That's right. Wesley paused, deciding how he wanted to proceed. We believe both these homicides were the work of the same killer, and we're trying to understand how the victims might be connected. We have reason to believe that the doctor may have visited your club in the days leading up to his death. He pulled out his phone to show him Dr. McCann's photo. Do you remember seeing him? Lucian dutifully studied the picture, but drew in a quick breath of air. Detective, on an average Friday or Saturday night, we have 600 people come through that door. He shook his head. By last call, I'm completely beat. Unless he's a regular or I personally escort him from the building, I wouldn't be able to pull any one of our patrons out of a lineup. Wesley nodded, feeling a slight kick of disappointment. He'd known it was a long shot. Lucian shifted as if he intended to get up, but Wesley wasn't ready to let him go just yet. He had a feeling that someone knew something. It was just a matter of finding them. Thinking hard, he caught a glimpse of Gabriel's wrist. He was turning his tumbler of whiskey absently, still watching the tattooed bartender out of the corner of his eye. The key stamp on his wrist was black, not red as the victim's had been. Say, said Wesley, caught by a sudden burst of inspiration. The stamp we found on Dr. McCann was done in red ink. Is there any other club in town that has a similar emblem to yours? Excuse me, said Gabriel, getting up and walking toward the back of the club. The tattooed bartender had just caught sight of him and was staring at Gabe with something like recognition. Not in town, said Lucian, frowning, but our sister club in Fort Collins might use red. There's another back room in Fort Collins? Lucian nodded. Well, that was something, but it didn't quite fit. To Wesley's knowledge, no victims had turned up in Fort Collins. Yet. We also use the red stamp for our play parties, said Lucian in an offhand voice. Play parties? Lucian tilted his head to the side, looking suddenly reticent. Twice a month, we hold a play party for the BDSM community. They take over the whole club. And when was the last one of these parties? A week ago Thursday. Suddenly, it was as if a light had gone on for Wesley. Any, party-goers come in from out of town? Oh, yeah, said Lucian. They come from all over. We have some of the largest gatherings in the state. Any of your normal help work the party that night? Lucian nodded slowly, looking as though he were trying to remember. Shelley, I think. I can't remember who else. I'd have to check the schedule. And your next party is? This Thursday. It's leather night. Wesley raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. I'd like to come if you don't mind, to see if anyone there remembers Dr. McCann. I'll have to clear it with the dungeon master first. Generally, all first-timers must know someone in the community who will vouch for them. That would be great, said Wesley, wondering what the hell a dungeon master was. Is there anything I should know about the party? Just that the dress code is strictly enforced. Make sure you wear something leather. Wesley must have looked uneasy, because Lucian added, No one is required to participate, though newcomers tend to be popular. I'll try to blend in, said Wesley. At that moment, Gabriel walked back over, looking slightly relieved. Thank you, Mr. Alexander, said Wesley quickly. You've been very helpful. I hope so, Detective. Please let me know if I can help with anything else. I will. It was good to meet you, he said to Gabriel. Gabriel nodded and took his seat. Excitement raced through Wesley's veins. It was too early to say for sure, but his gut told him he was on to something. Chapter 7. Gabriel. The Backroom's sister club in Fort Collins was a total bust. I'd gone to check it out the night after Wesley invited me to the club, trying to keep a low profile. Fort Collins wasn't technically my territory, but the trip was uneventful. From there, I decided that my best bet was to track down the new clan that had sprung up in Hilltop. If Letitia was a night supremacist, that made her a likely candidate for both the murders and the clan's sire. I had a feeling that if I found the clan, I'd draw her out of hiding. I rode my motorcycle in case I ran into trouble. I preferred the bike over the Audi. It allowed me to squeeze through tight spaces and disappear easily, but a motorcycle was terrible for moving dead bodies. I'd had at least half a dozen bikes over the years, but my current street bike was a Kawasaki Ninja ZX-10R. It was sleek and fast and extremely lightweight. It allowed me to go pretty much anywhere I wanted. Blazing down the deserted street through the Cherry Creek shopping district, it occurred to me that Hilltop was a strange place to raise a new brood of vampires. The giant Crate and Barrel and the Trader Joe's I passed on the way offered a clue about the type of people who lived in Hilltop. Many of the houses on the tree streets went for $1 million and up, but then again, most vampires had accumulated a great deal of wealth by the time they reached Letitia's age. Sires were known to take care of their clans, and investing in pricey real estate wasn't unheard of. The steeply pitched roofs of the great red brick Tudors seemed to glare at me from the backs of their well-manicured lots as I zipped up the residential street. This was the type of place where people knew their neighbors and paid a professional landscaper to keep their hedges straight. It was much too respectable for residents not to notice strange people coming and going at all hours of the night. They'd certainly notice if neighbors started turning up dead. Depending upon whom you asked, vampirism could be considered an identity, an affliction, or a lifestyle. Some fed in secret and wiped their victims' memories. Others adopted mortal pets, flunkies with whom they shared some kind of sexual power dynamic. To some, the way a vamp had been turned was everything. Some had been fed on for decades as mortals before they begged their sires to turn them. Others had been turned against their will, killed with vampire blood in their system, and then fed human blood after they reanimated. But no matter how they satiated their thirst, vampires all had one thing in common: the need for human blood. A vampire could survive for a time on the blood of large game, but I'd never known one who drank solely from animals and lived for more than a year. Animals didn't have high enough concentrations of ether in their blood, and vampires had to drink so much of it to keep themselves going that a steady diet led to what they called blood bloat. It made them weak, slow, and sickly. Those vamps were usually killed by their sire. Parking my bike near the corner, I got off and started walking back toward 4th Avenue. The tall trees cast long shadows through the pools of light from the street lamps. Most houses had their porch lights on, and a small yappy dog barked as I passed. Through the large picture window in the front of one house, I could see a husband and a wife watching the news. Everything appeared to be in order, but looks could be deceiving. Up ahead, I heard the rhythmic slap of footsteps. A lone figure passed under a street lamp. He was dressed in a black t-shirt and wore a pair of earbuds. Just a jogger, I told myself. I didn't sense a vampire, but my right hand itched for the stake in the modified holster under my jacket. I held my breath as the jogger approached, but he cut across the grass and onto the street to give me a wide berth. I let out the breath I'd been holding. Apart from the distant hum of traffic and the occasional dog barking, the street was quiet. It had me on edge. I reached 4th Avenue and cut over to Delilah Street, where I could see a row of the same type of houses with stuffy arched entryways and long, elegant walks leading up from the street. The wind kicked up, making leaves skip along the curb. Up ahead, I saw the same jogger cut across the street, perpendicular to where I stood. Something wasn't right. I could feel a slight prickle along the back of my neck and knew I was being followed. Turning slowly on the spot, I saw a petite blonde teenager standing just outside the glow of the streetlight. She had long, stringy hair and pale, chalky skin, and I knew immediately that she was a vamp. It was difficult to tell until you'd seen one up close, but vampires stand much too still. They try to compensate by forcing themselves to breathe, but it's never completely natural. Mortals always move a little or shift their weight from side to side. Vampires are as still as statues right before they attack. I didn't think. I just pulled up the sleeve of my jacket and fired an arrow from my wrist bow. The vampire's hand shot out in a flash of white, snatching the arrow out of midair. "Shit," I muttered as she snapped it in two. It was a poor excuse for a real stake, but it could subdue a vampire if you struck one in the heart. I knew the vamp was going to pounce a split second before it happened. She disappeared from where she'd been standing, flying toward me through the darkness. I turned just in time and grabbed her by the arm, slamming her into a parked car. Pinning her with one arm, I freed my stake from its holster. But then the vamp bared her fangs, and I saw the hunger in her eyes. The teenaged vamp hadn't fed that night, and my blood was even more tempting than a mortal's. I couldn't let her sink her fangs in. Vampire venom had a sedating effect. Once it got into your bloodstream, you quickly lost the urge to fight. I was so distracted by the gleam of her fangs that I didn't notice the second vampire until he was upon me. One moment, I was fighting to sink the stake into the first vamp's heart. The next, I felt the rough wood cutting into my windpipe as a male vamp tried to choke me from behind. This vamp was pudgy and middle-aged. He could have been the teen vamp's father. I tried to flip the second vamp and failed, giving him the opportunity to tighten his hold. I could feel his cool breath on my face as he brought his fangs close to my neck. The stake was pressing into my windpipe, making it difficult to breathe. Grabbing onto the ends of the stake, I braced my feet on the hood of the car and tried to push it away from my throat. I succeeded in opening my airways enough to breathe, but the vamp was too strong for me to break his hold. I looked around. I sensed more vampires approaching. 2 of them shuffled slowly across their lawn, a normal-looking husband and wife. Another came from a house on the other side of the street. A 4th had stepped out to water the lawn and was now headed straight for me. Had the clan taken over the entire block? Releasing one hand from the stake, I threw my fist over my shoulder and shot another arrow. A howl of pain shattered my eardrum as it skewered the vamp through the eye. It wasn't a kill shot, but it was enough to yank myself free from his grip. Just then, a car turned down the street and slowed to a crawl. It wasn't a car the vampires recognized, probably a mortal who'd taken a wrong turn. The vamps froze, deciding what to do, and I sprinted up the walkway of the adjacent house. Vaulting the fence, I ran for my motorcycle, which was parked on the next street over. I was sure the vampires weren't far behind, but they were concerned about drawing attention. A motion-detecting light came on as I tore through someone's backyard. I heard a low, booming bark, but I'd managed to catch the dog by surprise. I heard its claws scrape along the deck, and my shadow stretched cartoonishly as I ran. Jaws snapped at my heels as I flung my body over the fence and landed on the other side. Thankfully, this yard had neither a dog nor a fence. It was a straight shot to the corner where I had parked my bike. I could see it gleaming under a streetlight. Jamming on my helmet, I threw a leg over the bike and started the engine. I peeled out in a wide circle just as a pair of bright headlights whipped around the corner. I caught a glimpse of bloodthirsty eyes as I flew past a black Mercedes. I whipped around the corner as fast as I could, heading for the highway so I could lose them faster. A screech of tires in the distance told me the vamps had followed, but the howl of wind in my ears drowned out everything else as I merged onto I-25. The other cars became colorful streaks as my speedometer crept past 90. Broken white lines faded to a blur, but then I saw familiar headlights behind me. Shit. The lights appeared and then disappeared as the vampires stared down my tailpipe. Then I was blinded by another flash of lights and heard the roar of another car behind me. This one was a Porsche. The vehicles flanked me on either side, and I glanced over in time to see the vampire who tried to strangle me. My arrow was still lodged in his eyeball, and I turned back toward the road to decide how to lose them. Traffic was thinner at this time of night, but there was still a steady stream of cars. Up ahead, I could see a bottleneck of traffic. Surely the vamps would try something before we reached it, or risk me flying down the center line. I was about to miss Colorado Boulevard, my last chance to exit the highway. Holding my breath, I let off the throttle and watched as the car zoomed ahead. My tires were warm, but it was still a tight turn as I veered across 2 lanes of traffic. I grinned. I could almost hear their howls of frustration. Young vamps may have had superhuman speed and strength, but they are much easier to fool. I took Colorado Boulevard and banked east on Highway 30, wondering if it was safe to head home. I made a wide loop, and my stomach dropped. The Porsche was coming right at me. "Damn it," I growled. How had they caught up? It must have taken some risky maneuvering. Groaning, I pulled the bike around and hit the throttle as hard as I could. I was in Kane's territory now, but I only cared about losing them. Jetting through the parking lot of an indoor storage place, I wasn't prepared for the Mercedes. It came flying around the corner at breakneck speed. I tried to stop, but I didn't have time. It collided with my front tire, and I went flying over the handlebars. I'd wrecked my bike plenty of times before, but I was never ready for it. Flying through the air after the initial ejection would have been fun, if not for the plummeting feeling of terror and the anticipation of pain. The entire left side of my body burned as I skidded across the blacktop. My head hit the ground with an agonizing smack, my helmet bouncing off the pavement. For a second, I just lay there, breath completely knocked out of me. There's always that moment of naked terror where you worry you won't be able to move. But my body hurt too much for me to be paralyzed. My legs still worked, I was relieved to note. Staggering to my feet, I pulled off my helmet. 3 vamps had gotten out of the Mercedes. My bike lay on its side between us, and I could hear the hum of the Porsche nearby. A second later, it squealed up beside me, and I knew there was no way out. All right, I thought. Come on, motherfuckers. If I was going to die, I planned on taking a few vamps down with me. Behind me lay a pile of wood pallets. I stomped on one to break off a board and then kicked until the plank split into 2. I broke the stake in half over my knee, and the blonde vampire took a step forward. Just then, I heard a high-pitched whine that sounded like a motorcycle, but it was too close to be coming from the road. It sounded as though it was right on top of us. The beam from a single headlight streamed over the pavement as a black and white Honda CBR tore through the parking lot. The rider drove straight at the cluster of vampires, who scattered like rats in a kitchen. The biker made a tight turn and pulled around to face me as a third motorcyclist peeled into the parking lot. The first rider jumped off and tossed down his helmet. I let out a groan. It was Kane. "You shouldn't be here, Pierce." "This clan's mine," I called. "They followed me from Hilltop." In truth, I had no business hunting them, since I couldn't link the clan to the murders. But he didn't need to know that. Cain was a tall beefcake of a man with huge biceps and a little pinhead. He had a repeating crossbow slung over his shoulder, and he fired off 3 arrows into the knot of vampires, dropping the dad vamp with an arrow in his eye. The 2 vamps nearest Cain lunged for his crossbow, and another pair attacked the mystery rider. As the final vamp encroached on me, I realized that they'd given Cain and me a convenient excuse to take out their entire clan. My vampire lunged, knocking me to the ground. Every inch of me already hurt. It bared its fangs like the colonel when provoked, and I rolled it off me and lunged. I drove the stake through its heart in one hard shove, eliciting an ear-splitting shriek. The cry swelled as the vamp's body ossified, finally dying out in the cool night air. The sound of breaking glass drew my attention. One of the vamps had tossed the mystery rider through the lobby window of the storage facility. Scrambling to my feet, I sprinted over and tried to stake the vamp from behind. It whipped around in a flash of fangs, knocking me to the ground. I hit the pavement harder that time, and my destroyed body throbbed in protest. If it hadn't been for the adrenaline, I might have blacked out. Every inch of me ached with deep tissue bruises. Hauling myself upright, I shot an arrow at the vamp's back. It arched in pain, stopping short of the rider, and wheeled around with a hiss. Casting around for my dropped stake, I felt something whoosh past my ear and the cool sting as it grazed it. The vamp staggered back and crashed into the desk, a full-sized arrow lodged in its heart. "You kill any vamps with that toy bow of yours?" Cain boomed. "Sometimes," I called, reaching up to touch my bloody ear. Recovering from my momentary shock, I looked down at the mystery rider. She was splayed in a pool of sparkling glass, clearly still stunned from the impact. I knew it was a she from the tight leather she was wearing and the shape of her body underneath. She was slim and had an athletic build. Her helmet had fallen back off her face, revealing a beauty mark just over her lip. "Morgan?" I choked in stunned disbelief. But I didn't have time to get a response. Cain's second vampire burst through the window, knocking me against the wall. I caught it with a right hook to the jaw, and it staggered back on its heels. I lunged for my stake, but the vamp's boot flew out, catching me under the chin. I hit the ground, and the vamp dove on top of me as I reached for my weapon. I shoved the stake up with all my strength as it opened its mouth. I heard a loud crack as I broke through bone, but I knew I'd missed its heart. The vampire dipped its head, and I felt a hard pinch. A pleasant warmth spread out from my neck, but I could feel its fangs inside me. I groaned in protest, but I didn't scream. My face and throat felt tingly. I could feel the venom spreading through my body, dulling my pain from the inside out. What had started out as a slight tingling warmth soon enveloped me in bliss. Any urge to fight quickly drained out of me. I could barely move my eyelids. Soon I was floating in a cocoon of comfort. I no longer cared that it was going to kill me. This wasn't so bad, I thought to myself. There were certainly worse ways to go. At least I wasn't in any pain, and my vision was a trippy swirl of color. I might have succumbed and let it take me if it weren't for the scratch of stubble. The sensation of a man's beard on my neck pulled me out of my daze. As awareness returned to my mind and body, I tried to struggle against him, but the venom had worked its way through my bloodstream, and I couldn't move a muscle. Terror raced through me as I lay there on the floor. The vamp was going to suck me dry. I would be awake but unable to move. Then I saw a dark blur rising. Something heavy collided with the vamp, eliciting a sting of pain. I heard a crunch of wood rip flesh and bone, and the vamp's weight dropped onto my chest. Morgan was standing over the vamp's prone body, shaking her head at my stupidity. I couldn't feel anything except irritation, even though the vamp was crushing my ribs. A few thoughts stuck with me as I drifted in and out. First, that Morgan was a dirty little minx, pumping me for information so she could poach my vamps. Second, that I was damn lucky she and Cain had shown up, and I would never live that down. Chapter 8. Wesley. Wesley always got the jitters when he went undercover, and that night was no exception. The difference was he was getting ready to crash a BDSM party, and he wasn't at all sure how easy it would be. He cruised the mostly empty third floor of the parking garage to make sure they were alone. Then he pulled his truck up alongside Ruby's bright red Camry. When he rolled down his window, she was freshening her makeup, applying black lipstick and messing with her hair. She'd styled it in heavily gelled curls that clung to her scalp for a slicked-on effect. When she'd finished, she popped the mirror back up and got out, hiking up her pleather pants as she stood. The look was completed by a leather vest and boots, but she pulled a black raincoat on over her outfit for a more discreet walk to the club. "Wow, you sure look the part," said Wesley as she climbed in his truck. He was impressed and a little more nervous. He'd been assured that these play parties didn't involve actual sex, but they sounded pretty edgy. Ruby glanced in his direction, snapping a spiked leather cuff onto her wrist. "And you could not look more like a cop." Wesley opened his mouth but closed it again. Costumes had never been his forte. He was wearing a t-shirt, dark jeans, and a black leather jacket that he hadn't worn in years. He also had on a pair of black leather boots, but these just looked like ordinary footwear, not the tall spiked stilettos that Ruby had on. She shook her head and rummaged in her enormous bag, which was also made of black leather. "Put this on," she said, brandishing a long leather strap with silver rings attached to more straps. It jingled as she moved it, and Wesley wasn't immediately sure how he was supposed to wear it. "What is that?" he asked. "It's a harness," said Ruby. Her voice was brisk and matter-of-fact. She wasn't embarrassed at all. "It goes around your chest." "You've been to one of these before. There's a lot you don't know about me." "Clearly," said Wesley, his mouth lifting into a smirk. Ruby gave him a stern look. Wesley cleared his throat, slightly worried, and then shrugged out of his jacket. He threaded an arm through one strap of the harness, but Ruby stopped him with a hiss. "You've got to take your shirt off," she said impatiently. "Nobody's going to tell us anything if they make us before we even walk through that door." Wesley didn't respond, but he did pull his shirt over his head and slip obediently into the harness. The metal rings were cold against his bare skin, but the leather straps weren't so bad. They fit around his upper chest and shoulders about as comfortably as a gun holster. His actual gun was concealed in the roomy sheath of his boot. He couldn't wear it on his belt and risk someone at the party noticing it. He didn't ask where Ruby had her weapon. Glancing down at her tight leather pants, it was no place he wanted to know about. "Jacket on over that," Ruby muttered, once the harness was snugly in place. Wesley did as he was told, and Ruby cracked a satisfied grin. "There, that looks pretty good." Wesley snorted. He wasn't sure anyone was going to buy this getup, but he decided to defer to Ruby's expertise. Once she was convinced that he wasn't going to blow their cover, she slipped out of the truck and set out ahead of him. They decided to arrive at the party separately. For one thing, discussing who would play the dominant and who would play the submissive was not a conversation Wesley wanted to have with his new female partner. For another, arriving as apparent strangers would give them the freedom to move around the party separately. Even though Lucian had given both their names to the dungeon master, whoever that was, Wesley still wasn't sure how easy it was going to be to walk their way into this party. He knew from experience that infiltrating a niche community, particularly one as tight-knit and secretive as the Denver BDSM scene, wasn't something one could rush. When he'd worked Vice, it had taken him 18 months to get close enough to collar the leader of a dangerous narcotics ring. But if they were dealing with a spree killer, they needed to catch her before she cooled off and disappeared from their radar. The night was pleasantly crisp and breezy as Wesley made his way to the club. He was glad he'd worn the heavy leather jacket. He would have been just right for the weather if he hadn't been forced to go shirtless underneath. When he reached the entrance to the club, he was relieved to see that he hadn't been entirely off base with his choice of clothes. The man working the door was your typical beefy bouncer, dressed in a tight leather shirt. He was wearing leather chaps over his jeans, but other than that, he looked pretty normal. "Name?" he asked. "Wesley Smith." "All right, Mr. Smith. I assume you've been briefed on the rules for the evening?" No touching others without their permission. No smoking, no drugs, no guns. No taking photos or video once inside. I'll need to confiscate your cell phone. No nudity, except in the blue room. That's first come, first serve. Keep it safe and consensual. Don't interrupt anyone else's scene. What happens in the dungeon stays in the dungeon. Do you agree to these terms? Yes, Wesley stammered, handing over his phone. It was password protected, but it still made him uneasy. The cover is $40. That includes 2 drink tickets. Additional tickets may be purchased from the dungeon master. Wesley reached for his wallet and forked over the cash, and the bouncer jerked his thumb behind him as a way of gesturing him inside. Have fun. Fun wasn't the word that came to mind as Wesley stepped inside the club. He was sweating under his jacket, which made the leather harness stick to him uncomfortably. Familiar pop music was blaring over the speakers as he walked down the narrow hallway leading to the main floor. The back room looked pretty much the same, apart from the leather-clad patrons roaming the dance floor and lounging in the booths. As Wesley cast around for Ruby, a pale man in a leather hood and short shorts walked in front of him, led on a leash by a pixie-like woman in leather lingerie who blew a kiss at another girl as she passed. At the table nearest him, a muscular man in a leather vest had been blindfolded, and an attractive woman with a riding crop was marching a slow circle around him. The man was quivering slightly, but whether he was nervous or just excited, Wesley couldn't tell. There were other scenes unfolding up on the balcony, but there was nothing except the occasional crack of a whip and a whimper to indicate what was happening. It wasn't really Wesley's thing, but he felt his body relax with the realization that it wasn't nearly as bad as he'd imagined. Everyone in his line of sight seemed to be having fun. They were laughing and joking and bringing around drinks. Mostly, he was struck by how normal they all seemed, apart from the leather and the props. Finally, he spotted Ruby up on the balcony, leaning against the rail. She had her back to the crowd below, but he could tell that she had a good vantage point from which to observe the party. Her head turned in his direction as he passed below, but she didn't make eye contact or give any indication that they knew one another. Since she had the entrance and the balcony covered, Wesley found a seat at the bar beside 2 leather-clad patrons. He ordered a drink from a bartender he recognized, the redhead who'd waited on him the other night. Apparently, they were serving from a limited menu. The drinks were all sweet-sounding concoctions named after sex acts, and Wesley chose the only one that didn't contain any Baileys or Kahlua. He handed over 1 drink ticket and took a cautious sip, puckering his lips at the strong taste of triple sec. Good turnout tonight, he said to the man sitting on his left. He was dressed in a leather vest and a collar, but looked friendly enough. Are the parties always this packed? The man turned his head in Wesley's direction but didn't respond. The man sitting on his other side stood up, shooting Wesley a dirty look. He conferred briefly with the man in the collar, and the 2 of them walked off. Was it something he'd said? You're new, came a voice to his right. It wasn't a question. Wesley turned to look at the woman who'd had her back to him before. She had pale porcelain skin and long strawberry blonde hair that fell over her back in a smooth rippling curtain. She turned her chin to look over her shoulder, and he caught the flick of a lipstick smirk. Is it that obvious? He asked. The woman's smile broadened, and she swiveled around on her bar stool to face him. Under a silky black trench coat, she was dressed in a leather leotard, fishnets, and tall, spiky boots. Wesley's eyes lingered too long on the milky skin beneath her leotard, but he froze when he confronted her penetrating gaze and blood-red lips. The lipstick should have looked garish on someone of her complexion, but it didn't. If anything, it made her pale skin seem almost luminous. It's considered impolite in our circle to speak to a submissive without the permission of his or her dom, she explained, nodding at the man who'd left. That's what the collar means? Wesley asked, feeling very obtuse. The woman nodded. Thank you for explaining that, said Wesley graciously. And you're right. I am new here. I figured, she said, licking her lips. I've never seen you before, and I know just about everyone. You go to a lot of these things? I run them, she said at once, holding out an elegant hand. Madame Letitia, Dungeon Master. She brushed the silver pin on her lapel with her free hand. The text was engraved on a shield like a coat of arms, and she rolled her eyes a bit. Wesley took her hand and shook it. Her grip was light, but he could feel the strong solidity of her bones underneath. Her skin was cool to the touch. Wesley. Wesley, she repeated, narrowing her eyes in pleasure as if she liked the sound of his name. And what brings you to our little soiree? Oh, just curious, I guess. Madame Letitia nodded, as if she heard this a lot. And what about our circle made you curious exactly? Wesley thought for a moment, racking his brain for something convincing. It just seemed sexy. You'd like to try being dominated by a beautiful woman. As she spoke, she held his gaze, and Wesley found himself agreeing. There was something about those dark eyes. They weren't just beautiful, they were hypnotic. Staring at Madame Letitia, Wesley felt as though she were holding him captive with nothing but her mysterious allure. Her eyes flickered to the balcony, where Wesley was still aware of Ruby watching the party below. But there is another woman who looks as though she'd like to make you her plaything. I don't think so, Wesley chuckled, feeling a strange sense of giddy relief as Madame Letitia released her gaze. I know a dom's brand when I see one. You've had that woman's attention ever since you walked in. It's almost as if you know each other. Wesley swallowed. Either he and Ruby hadn't been as discreet as he'd thought, or the madam had a sixth sense. His brain groped for some scrap of information from the articles he'd skimmed about BDSM. I think it's best to leave the outside world out there, he said, stumbling a bit over his words. The suggestion that he knew Ruby from somewhere else seemed to appease Madame Letitia, if for no other reason than it had a ring of truth. I know why you're really here, she said after a moment, nodding at the pretty red-headed bartender. You've been here every night looking for someone, I hear. Wesley's breath hitched. So much for bartenders' reputation for discretion. Since you're new here, Letitia continued, let me give you some advice. She swiveled her body around to face his, crossing one leg over another and holding him captive with her gaze once again. Don't go playing with fire, detective. You're liable to get burned. Alarm bells were going off in Wesley's head, but the warnings were somewhat muted by the power of Letitia's eyes. He tore his gaze from her, about to stand up, but Letitia put one delicate hand on his thigh. Don't fret, darling. Your secret's safe with me. He glanced back up at her face, clearing his throat as he prepared to excuse himself. But as soon as her eyes latched onto his, Wesley seemed to forget why he'd come to the party in the first place. This wasn't his scene, but he didn't hate it. Most everyone he'd encountered seemed nice. But as he stood there, the other party-goers seemed to fade into the background. All he could see was Letitia's pale, angelic face, framed by a curtain of spun copper and gold. Her pale lashes were painted black, intensifying her deep, dark eyes. Every muscle in his body tensed as she got to her feet, that hand still pressed firmly into his thigh. His heart was pounding, but he couldn't move. It was as if he was glued to his seat. She took one step forward and positioned her hips directly between Wesley's legs. She lifted her hand from his thigh and trailed it up his hip bone and along his ribs, bringing it to rest just below his clavicle. She traced a line straight across the bone, lingering for a moment at the base of his throat. His chest was rising and falling rapidly, but Letitia stood as still as a statue, watching the rapid flutter of his pulse. He wasn't even sure that she was still breathing. She leaned in to whisper something in his ear, and Wesley was engulfed by her sweet floral scent. You didn't come here for work, she whispered softly, those red lips brushing the tender flesh at his neck. You came here to play. With me, I think. Wesley's throat had gone very dry, but he managed a hoarse grunt of assent. That wasn't it, was it? He had this feeling that wasn't why he'd come to the party, but he was powerless to disagree. Letitia pulled back, and he was hit once again by the full force of her gaze. Suddenly, it made perfect sense. Wait for me here, she said, stepping back so quickly that Wesley's breath left him. I'll show you the ropes, so to speak. Chapter 9. Gabriel. The sushi bar was crowded when I pulled up in the parking lot. It was a sleek, modern restaurant with ceiling-to-floor windows that ran the entire length of the building. The name of the restaurant was burned into the hanging wooden sign over the door, with Japanese characters underneath. Parking my car, I got out and pushed my way through the clump of people congregating inside the door. Wesley's truck was already there, so I assumed he'd gotten a table. The strong aroma of fish assailed me as I walked through the door, and I wrinkled my nose as I cast around. Gabe. I looked over and saw Wesley sitting at a low bamboo table in the far back corner. He looked extremely out of place, propped up on a silk pillow at a knee-high table. A pale-haired woman was seated beside him, and I felt a slight tingle along the back of my neck. I held back a groan. So that was why he'd wanted to meet here. Wesley wasn't a sushi kind of guy, but he was accommodating to a fault. Whenever he was dating someone new, he went along with whatever she liked. I'd seen him do yoga and transcendental meditation. He'd even gone vegan for a week. This woman was pale, very thin, and fine-boned. She had long golden hair that glowed slightly red in the dim light that hung over the table. She wore bright scarlet lipstick and a plum velvet jacket with little wingtips that jutted out at the shoulders. She looked to be in her early 40s, but she was probably at least 200. The stink of vampire was so strong as I approached that I would have smelled it in the parking lot had it not been for the fish. A low growl rumbled in my throat, too soft to be audible to Wesley. Gabe, I'd like for you to meet Letitia. The vampire held out her hand, presumably so that I would sit. How do you do? I hesitated. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to leap across the table and stake her with a chopstick, but the restaurant was full of people. Sit down, Gabriel, the vampire ordered. I shot Wesley a glance, but he looked at me glassy-eyed, so the vampire was controlling him. She reached across the table for the squatty black teapot and poured with a graceful white hand. Sit down, she repeated, not looking up, or I'll break your brother's neck. Moving slowly with the effort of maintaining my self-control, I sank down onto a red silk cushion. Every muscle in my body was clenched, straining against my effort not to rip into the vampire. I hear you're the one who murdered my protégés, said Letitia coolly. So they were yours, I said, not mentioning that it had been a group effort. Her hand was steady on the handle of the teapot, but I could see the fury dancing behind her cold black eyes. I'd felt pretty confident that killing the new clan would bring their sire out into the open, and it turned out I'd been right. To be fair, they did try to murder me first. Let's skip the games, said Letitia curtly. Fine. How about you let my brother go, and I won't go back to Hilltop to finish off the rest of your clan? That doesn't work for me. You killed 6 healthy young vampires who were like family to me. It only seems appropriate that I take something from you. I glanced at Wesley. He hadn't batted an eye at the talk of murder, which told me he was deeply brainwashed. If you hurt my brother, I rumbled, swiveling my gaze back to her, I won't stop until every last vampire is staked and in the ground. Letitia held my gaze for a very long time. Wesley was just sitting there with a glazed look in his eyes, as if he were politely mingling at a cocktail party while his mind was somewhere else. You always did have terrible taste in women, I said, not expecting him to respond. That's rich coming from you. Your last date tried to sell me a timeshare. Wesley had snapped out of his trance long enough to crack a smirk, so he wasn't completely out of it. Leaning across the table, I latched onto his gaze until I could feel my mind boring into his. Get up and leave this place now, I said. Forget we were ever here. Wesley didn't move. Oh, Gabriel, Letitia scoffed. Did you really think a hunter could beat me at my own game? Wesley is my new favorite pet. He won't leave this restaurant until I tell him to, and I happen to be enjoying his company. I scowled, but she wasn't wrong. A hunter's power of suggestion didn't hold a candle to a vampire's. Hunters could make people do things and make them forget what they'd seen, but vamps could go as far as influencing a person's emotional state and even implanting false memories. I grimaced. Your last pets ended up 6 feet under. When a kid kills his first 4 hamsters, you don't get him a 5th. Mortal men are tasty, but not very durable. I can't help it if I get bored. So Letitia was the killer. What do you want? I asked. Clearly she wanted something from me, or she wouldn't have been flaunting my brother. Letitia picked up the menu with long, pale fingers, gazing down with a blasé expression. Her nails were painted the color of blood that perfectly matched her lipstick. I'd like to order some food, her eyes flashed, and maybe some sake. I had the sudden impulse to flip the table over and grab Letitia by the throat. But at that moment, our waitress appeared, and I clenched my fists under the table. Letitia asked about the sake, taking her sweet-ass time with her order. She smiled, and Wesley smiled right back, ordering a glass of wine as though he really were on a date. I'd seen this before with vamps and their pets. A vampire's mortal victims would be so enamored by the hypnosis that they'd do anything to appease their master. They'd smile and flirt and be the perfect lover as the vampire sucked them dry. I couldn't tell if she'd fed off Wesley yet. Mortal pets never bore any obvious marks like they did in movies. Any puncture marks would be soaked in the vampire's venom and would heal almost instantly. And for you, sir? Nothing for me, I said, not taking my eyes off Letitia. I won't be staying long. The waitress gave a demure nod and bustled away, and I leaned forward in my seat. What's it going to take for you to get up and walk away right now? We can't leave yet, said Letitia in a tone of mock disappointment. We haven't even ordered our food. I glared across the table at her, and she pulled a prim little smirk. Before I could stake her, the waitress reappeared, holding a narrow bamboo tray. She arranged the porcelain flask on the table with the edamame and sake cups. Then she set down Wesley's wine and asked if we needed anything else. No, thank you, said Letitia graciously, reaching out to pour us each a cup. Now, she said as the waitress left, let's discuss this like civilized people. What do you want? Letitia took her cup and sipped. I want my clan to be able to move and feed freely in the city. You know I can't write you a blank check to kill mortals. You can do whatever you want. I dragged in a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. If I don't take care of Denver's vampire problem, the Brotherhood will send another hunter. And I can't promise he'll be as charming and accommodating as I am. Letitia fixed me with a piercing gaze. You let me worry about that. I can take care of myself. I let out a huff of air between my teeth. This was the problem with really old vampires. They had so many rules and ancient customs, but they couldn't comprehend simple law and order. They were ruthless, bloodthirsty barbarians. I glanced at Wesley. I didn't think she'd fed on him yet. Letitia struck me as the type of woman who liked to delay gratification as long as possible. When she finally sank her teeth into flesh, it probably sent her into a frenzy of hunger and lust. She was experienced enough to control her urges, but she only controlled herself long enough to maximize pleasure. All the more reason to get her away from Wesley. Fine, I said, after a moment's deliberation. I won't interfere with you or your clan. Do what you like. Just do it north of I-70, would you? You see, said Letitia, her smile broadening. This is how the Japanese do business. Nothing smooths over differences like some good sake. She set down her cup, looking satisfied. My clan will hunt in the northern part of the city, and you will not touch them. I fought to keep my expression neutral as self-hatred and smugness competed for dominance. I hated negotiating with someone like her. I wanted to exterminate her clan myself, but at least this way she'd run into Cain. Now will you let my brother go? I asked, picking up the cup she'd poured for me in a gesture of goodwill. Letitia narrowed her eyes and smiled. No, I don't think so, she said, reaching over to pluck an edamame pod out of the bowl. She placed it delicately between her teeth, and I caught a glimpse of her long white fangs. Wesley is much too delicious. I fought the urge to upchuck the sake. A fresh wave of molten fury was coursing through my veins. Apparently, I would get the chance to stake a vampire that night. That would make me feel better. But then the waitress appeared at my elbow. "Are we ready to order?" "I don't think we need—" "Nonsense," said Letitia in a controlling voice. "We'll have the oysters, some sabe, humachi, and a sample of your house rolls." "Very good, ma'am. Anything else?" "No, that will be all." "Why him?" I asked, once the waitress was gone. "He doesn't seem like your type." I didn't know the specifics of Wesley's extracurriculars in the bedroom, but I was pretty sure he didn't enjoy being strangled. He was getting too close, the sweet, simple detective. For a mortal, he's not as obtuse as I would have thought, although I suspect he had some help. She eyed me with displeasure. "He does have the most delicious scent," she mused, "and he isn't entirely repulsive to look at." Slowly, Letitia reached over and dragged the tip of her nail down the side of Wesley's face. It dug into his skin briefly, leaving a slight indent on his cheek. Wesley looked over and cracked an awkward grin. I wasn't sure how much of our conversation he was aware of. He could have been screaming inside for all I knew. "You can't seriously be thinking of taking him back to your lair," I said quietly. "He's a cop. You don't want that kind of trouble." Letitia's eyes flashed in a way that made my stomach clench. "I am immortal, darling. I live for trouble. But it's nice to know I won't have any from you so long as my clan keeps to the north." I fell silent, studying her. Letitia didn't take her eyes off me the entire time. She just sipped her sake and leaned into Wesley, occasionally stroking him with the tips of her fingers. Wesley kept glancing at me and smiling uncomfortably, as if his subconscious embarrassment was winning out over Letitia's mind control. If he'd been on a date with a normal woman who was stroking him like that, I'd be giving him so much shit. Instead, I just felt sick to my stomach, and the appearance of our food didn't help. Something about all the raw fish laid out like a buffet in front of a vampire about to devour my brother seemed in poor taste. I couldn't stand sushi because of the smell, and I wondered how a vampire could tolerate it. "Dig in," Letitia said to Wesley, tucking a napkin into his shirt. I rolled my eyes. Wesley sat up, suddenly alert, and took a pair of chopsticks into his hand. He attempted to capture a piece of tuna roll, the least intimidating thing in front of him. I watched as Letitia deftly plucked a piece of sashimi off the platter and placed it in her mouth. I tilted my head to the side, fascinated. Watching a vamp eat human food was a bit like watching community theater. It was all very awkward and overdone, but entertaining nonetheless. Vamps could tolerate human food, but it didn't satiate their hunger. I'd heard that vamps lose their taste for anything other than blood once they've turned, but some kept to the ritual of mealtimes out of habit or made a big show of dining out to placate their mortal pets. "What is this?" I asked, narrowing my gaze. "Why bring me here? You must know that I won't keep my part of the bargain if you don't keep yours, and there's no way I'm letting you walk out of here with my brother." "Actually, darling, that's exactly what you're going to do," said Letitia, calmly placing another bite in her mouth. I rolled my eyes. "And why is that?" "Because there's one vampire for every 5 humans in this room." I glanced around, unable to conceal my alarm as the underlying odor of multiple vamps reached my senses. I'd been so focused on Letitia that I hadn't noticed it at first. Looking around, I could see that our waitress had disappeared. She'd been replaced by a dark-skinned vamp with a halo of tight black curls. A hulking blonde man in a too small chef's outfit was standing behind the counter where the mortal sushi chef had been, slamming a knife down on the cutting board. The vamps were everywhere. I counted at least 8 of them in the restaurant, posing as busboys, servers, and patrons. "If you try to stop me from walking out that door, my comrades will kill every mortal in this place." At those words, my blood began to boil. In truth, I would have gladly sacrificed every person in there to save Wes, but it went against the hunter's code. I couldn't allow all these people to die any more than I could stand by and watch her feed on Wesley and then dispose of him like yesterday's trash. I watched as Letitia produced her wallet and plucked out 4 crisp $50 bills. She placed them on the table and then got to her feet with the off-putting grace that all vampires had. "Come on, my darling," she said to Wesley. "We're leaving." I leapt to my feet. "Like hell you are." At those words, every vampire in the place seemed to stop what they were doing and turn to look in my direction. "Try me," said Letitia, threading a thin arm through Wesley's and patting him on the chest. "Follow me out or try to stop me, and their blood will be on your hands." Wesley flashed an awkward grin, as though he thought she was teasing. I still didn't quite understand how they did that, how they controlled mortals just enough to keep them passive while allowing their natural personalities to come through. A low growl escaped my throat as Letitia steered him out. Only Wesley was such a nice guy that he'd grin at the woman promising to murder him and a restaurant full of people. Heart pounding, I glanced around, taking quick inventory of the vamps. Most of them had returned to whatever human ruse they'd been assigned, but I could sense them watching me out of the corners of their eyes. The one wielding the sushi knife posed the greatest threat. He was armed and had 3 mortals within easy slashing distance. There was no way I was getting out of there without any bloodshed, and the second one of the vamps cut a mortal's throat, they'd lose any semblance of control. "Well, here goes nothing," I said grimly, picking up the nearest chair and smashing it on the floor. Chapter 10. Gabriel. The restaurant fell silent as one of the legs broke off and splintered to form a crude steak. There was the soft metallic clank of someone dropping a spoon, and everyone turned to stare at me. I chucked the sake decanter at Chef Vamp's head. It bounced off his temple and shattered as I leapt across the room. People sitting at the counter screamed as I vaulted the glass barricade and plunged the steak toward his heart. But Chef Vamp was ready, and he was strong. He grabbed me by the arm, holding the steak immobile, and I cursed myself for not having more steaks at the ready. All I had was the silver dagger in my boot and the sidearm strapped under my shirt, both of which were useless against a vamp. I couldn't move the steak any closer to the vamp's heart, so I stepped to the side. Chef Vamp had been pushing all his weight forward, so he toppled headlong into the sneeze guard. Glass rained down over the counter, and I plunged the steak into his back. A woman screamed. A few of the patrons got up and ran, 2 of them heading for the door. One of them moved so fast that it activated another vamp's prey drive. She tackled the man and tore into his throat, but I was fixated on the chef I'd staked. Almost immediately, his heart stopped beating, cutting off the flow of ether supplied by his victim's blood. Within seconds, the ichor solidified in his veins, turning his body hard like marble. I looked up at the encroaching vampires. About half of them were staring at me. The rest were drawn to the bleeding mortal on the floor, moved by their thirst for blood. The vampire who'd attacked him was in a frenzy. She was sprawled across the man's torso, her legs wrapped around him as she drank. Seeing her enjoyment, a brawny, younger-looking vampire edged his way in and tried to knock the first vampire off. She raised her head and growled like a hungry dog, and a third vamp joined in the fight. I rolled my eyes. When vampires were hungry, they were no better than animals, and young vamps were always hungry. A few of the brighter mortals in the bunch had started running for the door, but 2 of the vampires shot across the room, blocking their way out. The mortals weren't getting out of there alive, not if the vamps had any say in the matter. "Shit," I mumbled, upending the chair I'd broken and snapping off the other legs. The low tables around the perimeter only had cushions, but there were plenty of chairs in the middle of the restaurant waiting to become implements of death. I turned just as another vamp lunged toward me and drove a stake through his heart. He made a pathetic gurgling sound, his eyes bulging in surprise. He collapsed on the ground, and I snatched a knife off the sushi counter, throwing it at a skinny vamp who had 2 mortals cornered. The knife lodged in the back of his skull, and he blundered around to see who had thrown it. He was across the room in a flash, and I leapt onto the counter. Picking my way around wine glasses and plates, I jumped down and herded the mortals back toward the kitchens. If they escaped, I'd have to track them down, but that was easier than covering up their deaths. Just then, a vamp jumped on my back and looped an arm around my neck. I tucked my chin and threw my weight forward, tossing the vampire off. I turned and grabbed 2 long knives off the counter, skewering him through the abdomen. A few mortals screamed. The vampire yelled, but all I'd done was piss him off. He got to his feet, blood pouring from his wounds, and I stumbled back against a table. Somehow I managed to lose my steak. The vamp cocked his head to the side, his eyes black with hunger and rage. He was going to enjoy killing me. I'd have to kill him first. I fumbled behind me until I felt 2 chopsticks. They were flimsy, but I'd have to improvise. Grabbing the dagger out of my boot, I rushed the vamp and drove the knight into his breastbone. Blood gushed from the wound as I withdrew the dagger halfway, shoving the chopstick down beside it. The vamp's eyes bulged, and he howled in pain as I worked the chopstick into his heart. I winced as the ichor burned my skin, and I quickly pulled out my dagger. I wiped the vampire's shirt. Ichor, also known as blood of the undead, was highly corrosive stuff. The vamp fell to one knee as his body went rigid. The chopstick had done the trick. Looking over, I saw the 2 vamps who tried to disrupt the female's feeding. 3 of them were fighting amongst themselves. The other 2 vamps were terrorizing the mortals. One had bitten into a screaming blonde woman. He had her pinned against the window. Anyone outside would be able to see. I hoped no one called the police. Bashing a bar stool against the sushi bar, I broke off another few steaks. Even though I'd just murdered 3 of their friends, the vampires were too distracted by the aroma of blood to pay any attention to me. Bending down behind the female who'd been slurping up the mortal on the floor, I jammed a steak between her shoulder blades and watched her collapse on top of him. Her victim looked pale, but he would recover. Mortals could lose a lot of blood. The area around him was total carnage. His blood mixed with the dead vamp's ichor, and I heard a faint sizzle like acid. Just then, one of the 2 who had been fighting leapt onto my back. I grunted as my face hit the floor, and the 2 of us rolled through the puddle of blood. It burned my skin, and I reached for the steak, but it was inches from my grasp. Lifting the vamp by the shoulder blades, I bashed his head onto the floor. The tile shattered, but he wasn't even dazed. He thrust his hips to knock me off him and trapped my legs with his upper body. His fangs were bared. He wanted to feed. His eyes were bulging with hunger. A woman cowering under one of the tables shrieked, an ear-splitting sound that made it hard to think. "Shut up," I growled. "I'm handling it." But the woman continued to scream. Looking over, I saw her purse lying under the table. I grabbed it and looped the long leather strap around the vamp's neck like a leash. Wrapping the strap around on itself, I dragged the vamp toward my fallen steak. Grabbing it, I knelt on the floor and plunged the stake through his heart. I had to throw all my weight behind it, but I heard the satisfying crunch of his breastbone. The mortal woman took a breath. Or maybe she'd passed out from the shock. Looking over, I saw the vampire that had been in a tussle with the others. He was retreating like a wounded animal, but his gaze kept twitching toward the puddle of blood. He couldn't resist. Even when he knew the impulse to feed would get him killed, the bastard couldn't fight it. I staggered to my feet, ready to end him, and the woman under the table shrieked. "That's it," I sighed, rolling my eyes. It happened so fast the woman couldn't react. I yanked her out from under the table, drawing my dagger with my free hand. Her scream intensified at the sight of my knife, and I gripped her by the hair. I made a quick slice down the side of her arm. I might have enjoyed it a bit. Her scream faltered as the blade kissed her arm, and she started to hyperventilate. 3 heads snapped in our direction, the only 3 vamps left standing. The closest one to me lunged for the woman. I dropped her and grabbed my stake. The vampire tackled the woman to the ground, but I staked him before he could bite. His body stiffened, and I pulled him off her, thinking he might crush her to death. I dispatched the last 2 vampires and looked around. The mortals were staring at me with terror and confusion. A few of them lay dead. It was lucky the vamps had barricaded the door. It made my job more manageable. I could feel the mortals watching my every move as I crossed to the nearest dead vamp. I tugged off his belt and grabbed the bleeding mortal, looping the belt over her arm. She yelped as I pulled it tight like a tourniquet. Her skin was cold to the touch. "Who does she belong to?" I barked at the mortals. One middle-aged man stepped forward. "Your wife's in shock. Take her to the hospital. She's going to need a few stitches." Before releasing her, I took her by the shoulders and looked deep into her watery eyes. "Forget what happened tonight. You were never here. You cut yourself in the kitchen." The woman nodded and scurried toward her husband, who grabbed her uninjured arm. Shoving the furniture out of the way, I swung the front door open. The other mortals scurried after them like sheep, but I positioned my body between them and the exit. None of you will remember what happened here tonight. You didn't see anything strange. Don't come back here ever again. You don't like sushi anymore. The dead mortals and vamps needed to be dealt with, but I didn't stick around to do a thorough cleanup. Turning out the lights, I flipped on the close sign and locked the doors behind me. Starting up my motorcycle in the parking lot, I dialed the one person who might be able to help me. She was the only person besides Wes that I had on speed dial. Hunters didn't have many friends. Morgan, it's Gabe. There was a long beat of silence. Gabriel Pierce, I added. I rolled my eyes at her of recognition. I think she just did it to annoy me. What's up? She asked. I could hear her smirk. In a bit of a jam, I said. I could really use your help. Chapter 11. Gabriel. Wesley's house was dark when I drove past. The shades were drawn, but the colonel didn't bark, which meant that Wesley was at home. I knew Letitia would hear my bike, so I parked 2 streets over. I'd stopped by my apartment to grab my pre-made steaks. They were strapped to my chest with a modified vest that I'd picked up from an army surplus store. They were carved from walnut and sanded to a fine point, perfect for skewering vampires. I had a key to Wesley's place, so I let myself in the back door. I could see light coming from the end of the hallway and knew they were in the bedroom. Moving slowly, I hugged the walls to avoid any weak spots in the squeaky oak floor. I passed the hall bath and heard a scratch of claws, followed by a low, plaintive whine. Wesley must have locked the colonel in the bathroom. I actually felt sorry for the dog. He'd probably tried to warn Wesley that his new girlfriend was bad news. Drawing a stake, I raised it to shoulder height as I crept toward the master bedroom. The door was already opened halfway, and I could see Wesley lying on the bed. Letitia had him spread eagle and shirtless, his wrists bound to the wooden headboard. He had a ball gag stuffed in his mouth, and his face was flushed and sweaty. I let out a slow breath of relief. At least he was still alive. At first, I thought he might be alone, but then I spotted Letitia. She'd stripped down to a tight black corset, lacy panties, and stiletto boots. She held a riding crop in her hand as she paced, and I shoved down a moan of disgust. She was one of those vampires who liked to play with her food. I knew I didn't like her. Before I could reconsider my approach, she muttered something soft to Wesley and brought the riding crop down on his chest. He let out a moan as the leather tassel hit him, leaving an angry red mark in its wake. Stopping just outside the door, I tried to think of a better plan. Surprise would be my only advantage. Letitia probably thought I was dead. Barging into the bedroom would ruin that. So would breaking through the window. It didn't look as though they planned on leaving the bedroom, and Letitia was probably getting hungry. "Care to join us?" she asked in a low, seductive voice. I gritted my teeth. She must have sensed me. "That's pretty sick, even for you," I said, kicking the door wide open. Wesley lifted his head but didn't make any noise. The veins along his neck were bulging, and a flush had spread over his face. I wasn't sure if it was mortification or if he couldn't breathe. Letitia turned to me and squeezed the end of her riding crop, clearly enjoying the new twist to her game. "There's no accounting for taste, Gabriel." "That would require having some taste." Letitia quirked an eyebrow and continued to pace, her breasts jiggling as she walked. Her milky white skin stood out against the black fabric. I had to admit, she was hot. But my dirty thoughts were pretty much derailed by the sadistic look on her face. She seemed tickled by the turn of events, that I'd come to thwart her plans. "I'm curious, darling, what was your plan? Barge in here and demand that I give Wesley back?" I opened my mouth, but Letitia disappeared. By the time my eyes caught up with my brain, she was crouched on the bed, straddling him. She looked at me over her shoulder, pulling back her lips to reveal sharp white fangs. I shook my head, glancing at Wesley. I could hear his heart thundering in panic. Judging by the way her eyelids fluttered closed, Letitia could hear it too. She pounced so fast that I couldn't stop her from sinking her fangs into his neck. I didn't think. I just threw myself across the room and knocked Letitia off him. She rolled across the wide king bed, and her head smacked against the headboard. She continued to roll and landed on her feet, laughing as she wiped his blood from her mouth. In that moment, I realized that fighting Letitia wouldn't be like fighting those freshly turned vamps. Letitia was old and very experienced. She wouldn't be easy to fool. I leapt across the bed to stake her, but she threw out a high-heeled boot. It caught me hard in the center of my chest and sent me catapulting into the dresser. I cracked my head open, and Letitia perked up. I knew she could smell my blood. The only thing more irresistible to a vamp than mortal blood was the blood of a supernatural. We had more ether flowing through our veins. It was like pure heroin to a junkie. Letitia charged at me from across the room, using the bed as a springboard. She landed in a crouch over my lap, her lips mere inches from mine. She drew back her head, ready to strike, just as the window shattered. A blur of brown leather swirled through the opening, and Morgan crash-landed on the floor. Letitia whipped around, genuinely surprised. She'd only expected one hunter. I was the one who'd called Morgan, and even I wasn't prepared. "Whoa," said Morgan, straightening up and gawking at Wes on the bed. But Letitia seemed to recover first. Her hand flew up to her shoulder. I saw a flash of silver and let out a yell, but Letitia was too quick. All I heard was a grunt of pain from Morgan before her shoulders rolled forward. Fury surged through me as Morgan fell to the floor. This couldn't be happening, not to her. But then I saw Morgan raise her head and clamp a fist around the handle. The dagger was lodged just below her collarbone, near the crease of her shoulder. Her face was white with shock and rage, but I didn't stop to help her. For a hunter in battle, it was kill or be killed, and Morgan was tough as nails. Diving across the room at Letitia, I brought my stake down in a deadly arc. I managed to tackle her and pin her for an instant before Letitia rolled me over. She jumped to her feet, but I hooked her ankle and knocked her back to the ground. Her face tightened in an expression of pain, but then she trapped my leg. I winced as Letitia locked in her grip. She was trying to break my femur. I threw my other leg up and over, kicking her under the chin. Letitia sprung back and lunged for the door, but I was right behind her. I snatched her by the back of her corset, tossing her onto the floor. Her head struck the base of the footboard, and for a moment I thought she'd been stunned. I dove in, ready to stake her, but it had only been a ruse. Letitia pulled another dagger, and I dodged it just in time. Still, I felt the blade slice down my arm, and I gritted my teeth in pain. Letitia vanished, and I let out a groan. Where did she keep her knives? Getting to my feet, I stumbled into the hall, leaving a trail of blood behind me. I lunged across the living room at her, taking out both her legs. We went down hard and hit the coffee table, which shattered in a spray of glass. She rolled me over, and I howled in pain as the broken shards dug into my spine. I wasn't sure if vamps took jujitsu, but Letitia was impossible to pin. She landed on top, looking satisfied. She wasn't breathing hard at all. Meanwhile, I was heaving for air. That was one drawback to fighting a vamp. Letitia drew another dagger from her thigh holster. At least now I knew where she kept them. I let out a huff of pain and frustration, but then I heard a low creak and grinned. Holding the dagger to my throat, Letitia shifted so that she was straddling my pelvis and rolled her hips into mine. I might have been turned on if it weren't for the fangs and the murderous gleam in her eyes. I've never had a hunter before. This is going to be fun. More fun for me than for you, I grunted against the cold steel of her blade. Is that right? Letitia murmured, pressing in hard enough to draw blood. Yep. And why is that? A low growl was her answer. Letitia raised her head to look over my shoulder, where the colonel was standing, hackles raised. I knew that growl. It was the only sound I'd ever heard a dog make that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. Letitia didn't seem to know what to do. The colonel didn't have that problem. He lunged at the vampire, and Letitia shrieked as his strong jaw clamped down on her shoulder. She arced back and tumbled off me, and the colonel tightened his hold. I was sure her blood was like acid on his gums, but he didn't loosen his grip. I brought my stake down with a grunt of force, slicing clean through her chest. Letitia's shrill cry nearly shattered my eardrums as I watched the ether drain out of her. The colonel drew back, panting and bloodied, and I gave the dog a nod of approval. Morgan staggered into the entryway, clutching her chest in pain. She stopped just outside the living room, and we both watched Letitia's body transform. It was unnerving to watch a vampire ossify. It was sort of like crossing an ice-covered pond. My aim was good, but sometimes I missed the heart. I'd seen vamps reanimate as their bodies hardened. I wouldn't rest until Letitia was 6 feet under. "Thanks for that," I said to Morgan, feeling terrible that she'd been hurt. No problem," she said with a shrug that turned into a grimace. "It's not Friday night if I'm not getting stabbed. This was actually fun." Fun? Only a hunter would call that fun. She'd missed my Van Helsing total body workout earlier at the sushi place. I told her to hang on and rushed out to my motorcycle, where I kept an emergency first aid kit. It wasn't full of bandages and aspirin like a mortal kit. It was designed for supernatural wounds. "Sit down," I said to Morgan as I came back inside. She did what she was told, which meant she must have been in pain. I knelt on the ground in front of her, feeling slightly awkward as I examined her wound. Blood pooled from the gash when she pulled back her hand. It was deep, but not fatal to a hunter. Unzipping the leather pouch, I pulled out some antiseptic spray. Morgan closed her eyes as I cleaned the wound and found the glass vial I kept for patch-ups. It was 100% pure vampire venom, painstakingly harvested from half-staked vamps. Carefully unscrewing the tiny cap, I poured a few drops into her wound. The clear liquid dispersed as it made contact with her flesh, bonding to her blood and supercharging her cells. I watched in amazement as the wound started to heal. It would be completely gone by morning. "Thanks," said Morgan, sitting up straight and gingerly testing her range of motion. "No, thank you," I said. And I meant it. Morgan had no obligation to help me. Hunters worked alone. And yet she'd come the moment I had called and helped save my brother's life. She told me Kane had gone to clean up the restaurant, and I knew she'd cashed in a personal favor. When I finally worked up the courage to go back to the bedroom, Wesley was right where we'd left him. He looked up at me with fear and confusion as I leaned over to remove the gag. He choked a little as I pulled it out, and I noticed several small marks on his stomach. At least she hadn't gotten to the strangling part yet. "Gabe?" he choked, staring up in confusion. "What the hell was that?" I let out the heavy breath I'd been holding, feeling a familiar pinch in my chest. I wasn't sure if he was referring to Letitia or the total stranger who just crashed through his window. "What happened? Where's Letitia?" His eyes darkened as if he'd just remembered me tackling his date to the ground. "What did you do?" His tone was accusatory. That hurt a little. I wasn't sure what to say. Wesley had gone his whole life thinking that I was just like him. He didn't know my world even existed, and there was no reason for him to learn now. "I'm going to untie you," I said slowly. "But first, I want you to forget everything that happened tonight." Wesley stared back at me, looking dazed, and I forced myself to continue. "You went on a date. It did not go well. Someone broke in while you were gone and caused a whole lot of damage. But you aren't going to file a police report, nor will you be solving that case. You never saw me tonight, or the sexy brunette, and you never want to see Letitia again." I said all of this as convincingly as I could and watched the confusion hit him. It was always more difficult to persuade someone you knew. The closer you were, the harder it was. Some hunters said this was because you saw your loved ones on a regular basis, and eventually something would jog their memory. I thought it was because most hunters didn't want to hide things from the people they loved, and they subconsciously sabotaged themselves. A hunter's power over a person's thoughts didn't take if he felt conflicted. He had to want them to forget. But as I bent over to untie Wesley, I knew he wouldn't remember this. There was no part of me that wanted him to know who I was or what I did. This has been Blood Ties, a Witches of Mountain Shadow prequel novella. Written by Tarah Benner, narrated by me, Tarah Benner, If you enjoyed this novella, you may want to check out my professionally narrated audiobooks at my website, tarahbenner.com/audio. That's Tarah spelled with an H. Also, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss another audio adventure. Until next time, happy reading.